What if the fate of an entire nation hinged on one royal misstep? A wrong word, a rushed march, a marriage, a war, a whisper in the wrong ear. For 1,000 years, England's kings and queens made decisions that reshaped history, not through genius, but through failure. Some cracked crowns, others cracked empires. These weren't just mistakes, they were royal detonations. Welcome to 33 biggest English royal mistakes that changed history forever. Because when the throne slips, the world shakes. Before we dive headfirst into the chaos, make sure you're subscribed, especially if history, irony, and unintended consequences are your thing. It helps the channel, and it keeps you from missing the next royal catastrophe. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else is wandering through history with us tonight. 1. King Harold II, marching north and then immediately fighting at Hastings, 1066. There are bad decisions, and then there are the kinds of decisions that get you, your brothers, your best warriors, and your entire ruling class wiped out on a hill in southern England, ushering in one of the most brutal transfers of power in medieval European history. King Harold Godwinson, last crowned Anglo-Saxon King of England, didn't just make a tactical mistake in 1066. He might have accidentally handed over his entire kingdom by trying to win 2 wars in 1 week. It all started with a death, and as usual, it was the wrong person who died. Edward the Confessor, the childless monkish King of England, passed away in January 1066 without a direct heir. Cue the power vacuum. Harold, England's most powerful noble and a man with more enemies than allies, seized the crown. Technically, he was elected by the White Najamot, the Anglo-Saxon Council of Nobles, but this didn't stop 2 other men from believing they had a better claim. Harald Hardrada, the thunder god of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years before, and more dubiously, that Harold had sworn loyalty to him. By late September, Harold had more than one problem. First, the Norwegians invaded from the north, sailing up the Humber and crashing into Yorkshire like they owned the place. They were led by Hardrada, a man whose name literally means hard ruler, and Harold's own brother Tostig, the sort of sibling betrayal that's practically mandatory in medieval politics. Harold II responded with stunning speed, marching his army over 185 miles from London to Stamford Bridge in just 4 days. There, he crushed the invaders in one of the bloodiest victories in English history. Hardrada and Tostig were killed. The Norwegian army was annihilated. The north was, for the moment, safe. And that's when Harold made the fatal choice. Instead of resting, replenishing, and waiting to see what William of Normandy would do next, he turned his army around and marched it all the way back south, another 250 miles, in barely 2 weeks. Think about that. 2 forced marches, 1 massive battle, no meaningful pause, no time to recruit, no time to rest. His army was exhausted, wounded, and likely reduced in number. But William had landed in Sussex with a professional, well-fed, well-rested force. The contrast could not have been more stark. One army had crossed the Channel on boats designed for horses, trained with discipline in siege and field warfare, and was backed by the papal banner. The other had just finished hacking through Norse berserkers in Yorkshire. Harold chose to engage them almost immediately. Maybe he believed speed would catch William off guard. Maybe he feared desertion or uprisings if he hesitated. Maybe he remembered what happened the last time an English king waited too long. Spoiler, they died. But whatever his reasoning, it led to the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, and to a slaughter that made English rule look like a tragic footnote. The battle was brutal, but it wasn't even close to fair. The Anglo-Saxon forces had the high ground, and they formed a shield wall, a tactic that worked beautifully for about 6 hours. Then, the Norman cavalry began feigning retreat, luring English soldiers away from their tight formation. It worked. The shield wall broke, chaos ensued. Harold was killed. Legend says by an arrow to the eye, but more likely he was hacked to death in a royal dog pile. And with his death, Anglo-Saxon England died with him. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. The English elite was decapitated, literally and politically. William became the Conqueror, crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. What followed was not a simple regime change, it was a total system reboot. Norman lords replaced Anglo-Saxon ones. French replaced Old English in the royal court. Castles sprouted up like iron mushrooms across the countryside. Even the church was restructured under Norman loyalists. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, was basically an audit of what was left to rule. And all of this might have hinged on one decision, whether or not to delay the second battle. Modern historians are split on how much blame Harold actually deserves. Some argue that he had no real choice. England couldn't afford to let William dig in and establish a beachhead. Others think he should have waited for reinforcements, let William run low on supplies, and then crushed him with overwhelming force. It's a debate of logistics versus optics, speed versus sustainability, fate versus folly. But one thing is certain. If Harold had lived, there would have been no William the Conqueror, no Norman England, no Tower of London, no feudal revolution, no language shift, no royal line stretching all the way to today's Windsors. In short, no Britain as we know it. Harold lost his life, his throne, and his dynasty. But he gained something perhaps more eternal, a spot in every British schoolchild's timeline, a cautionary tale carved in stone just a few paces from where his bones were probably scattered. The last Anglo-Saxon king was brought down not just by a Norman duke, but by his own relentless will to fight, twice in 2 weeks at two ends of a kingdom. And yet it wouldn't be the last time an English ruler tried to do too much, too fast, and lost everything. Some centuries later, a king named John would try to hold on to his family's French empire by squeezing his own barons dry. The result? Rebellion, war, and a little document you might have heard of called the Magna Carta. 2. King John. Losing Normandy and provoking baronial revolt, 1204 to 1215. There are bad kings, and then there is King John. Not just disliked by historians, though he certainly is, but actively despised by nearly every chronicler who had the misfortune of living through his reign. Medieval monks referred to him as a tyrant rather than a king, a man of hellish disposition. Shakespeare turned him into a petulant footnote. The Victorians called him weak, cruel, and untrustworthy, and modern scholars, despite a few brave revisionists, still largely agree. John messed up, spectacularly, systematically, and with a consistency that borders on the impressive. But before the barons rose up, before Runnymede, before the Great Charter that launched 1,000 constitutional myths, there was Normandy. And John lost it, not in one sweeping defeat, but through a slow, clumsy erosion of diplomacy, trust, and raw competence. Let's set the stage. John was the youngest son of Henry, too, never meant to rule. He was nicknamed Lachlan, which was less a teasing jab and more a prophecy. By the time he became king in 1199, after the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart, the Angevin Empire stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. It was, technically, England's. But it wasn't going to stay that way. The empire depended on delicate relationships with French vassals, strong local alliances, and a king who could balance brutality with charm. John was none of those things. He alienated almost everyone who mattered. Nobles, churchmen, mercenaries, his own family. Where Richard inspired loyalty, John inspired accountancy, measured in fines, levies, bribes, and coerced loyalty. The real disaster began with the French king Philip II, a master opportunist who saw John's rise as a golden opportunity to break up Angevin control. John played directly into his hands. First, he married Isabel of Angoulême, already promised to another powerful French noble. which sparked a feud and gave Philip a pretext to summon John to court. John refused, naturally. He didn't do subordination, and so in 1202, Philip declared John's French lands forfeit. What followed was a textbook case of royal incompetence. John lost Brittany, then Anjou, then Maine, and finally, the heart of England's continental holdings, Normandy. By 1204, the dream of an Anglo-French empire had collapsed. English nobles with land on both sides of the Channel were forced to choose, and many quietly began aligning with Philip. The strategic disaster was sealed not with one crushing battle, but with a series of missed chances, broken alliances, and John's profound inability to hold on to trust or territory. The loss of Normandy wasn't just humiliating, it was financially devastating. For generations, the crown had used French lands as its economic engine. Without them, John faced a cash crisis and responded in the most John-like way possible, by squeezing his barons until their metaphorical bones creaked. He raised scutage, a tax on knights avoiding military service, to unprecedented levels. He seized estates on dubious legal grounds. He fined nobles for everything from marrying without permission to inheriting land without a royal kiss. Some called it reform. Most called it extortion. And here's the twist. John was actually a micromanager. He personally reviewed cases, corresponded with sheriffs, and took interest in law and administration. He wasn't lazy, just terrifyingly petty. Justice under John was not blind. It was deeply nearsighted and prone to tantrums. His use of royal power felt less like governance and more like a mob boss with a stamp collection. By 1214, John tried to reverse his fortunes by invading France again. He raised a massive tax, hired mercenaries, and assembled a coalition of northern lords and foreign allies. The result? The campaign collapsed at the Battle of Bouvines. Not only did John fail to retake any territory, but his allies were routed and his credibility imploded. He returned to England, not as a conquering monarch, but as a man with a depleted treasury, angry nobles, and no empire to show for it. What happened next is legendary, mostly because of what it produced: rebellion. The barons, long simmering under the weight of John's paranoia and pocket-picking, finally snapped. They marched on London. They forced John to the negotiating table at Runnymede, and there, in a meadow by the Thames, they extracted the Magna Carta, probably the most over-mythologized document in British history. Contrary to popular belief, the Magna Carta didn't invent democracy or establish freedom. It was a feudal contract, a list of baronial demands focused on taxation, inheritance, justice, and local control. Still, it set precedents. It planted ideas. Most importantly, it made clear that even a king could be bound by written rules. John, predictably, didn't stick to it. Within months he had the charter annulled by the Pope. War resumed. Castles were besieged. Barons invited a French prince to take the throne. John, meanwhile, did what all disastrous monarchs eventually do. He died mid-crisis. A bout of dysentery, mercifully unheroic, finished him off in 1216. His 9-year-old son Henry III inherited a kingdom on fire. Modern historians have tried to rehabilitate John. They point out that the machinery of government became more centralized, that his obsession with records laid the groundwork for administrative reform, and that he inherited a near-impossible position. All true, and yet, there's a difference between facing bad odds and making every possible situation worse. Had John handled French politics with tact, he might have preserved at least part of the Angevin Empire. Had he maintained the loyalty of the barons, England might have avoided civil war. Instead, his reign became a case study in alienating everyone at once: vassals, allies, the church, his own family, and eventually even the Pope, who at one point declared England a papal fief just to keep John under control. So yes, we owe John some credit, not for his achievements, but for how utterly he botched things. Without his errors, we might not have Magna Carta, but we also might not have needed it. And so, England was left bruised, divided, and poorer than it had been in generations. But history wasn't done delivering cautionary tales. Because while John's failures were mostly political, his son's distant cousin, Edward II, would soon show that poor leadership wasn't just a matter of diplomacy. It could get you humiliated on the battlefield, betrayed by your own allies, and eventually, well, let's just say it didn't end well. If you're still here 2 disasters in, congrats, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps more than you think. And while the Normans are tightening their grip and John's empire is crumbling, let me ask, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Middle of the night in New Delhi? Early morning in Edinburgh? Let me know down below. History hits different depending on the hour. 3. Edward II, Favoritism and the Bannockburn Disaster, 1314. Edward II came to the throne in 1307 with every possible advantage except the one that mattered most, the ability to rule people who didn't like him. His father, Edward I, had been a towering figure, feared, respected, and brutally effective. He conquered Wales, terrorized Scotland, and ruled with the kind of iron confidence that made obedience feel inevitable. Edward II inherited the crown, the wars, and the expectations. What he did not inherit was authority. From the very beginning, Edward II's reign felt wrong to the people who mattered. Not illegal, not illegitimate, just wrong. He preferred the company of favorites over experienced magnates. He disliked war, but insisted on leading campaigns. He resented advice, yet floundered without it. And most dangerously of all, he treated politics like a personal relationship problem rather than a system that required balance, compromise, and occasionally swallowing one's pride. The central issue had a name, Piers Gaveston. Handsome, charming, foreign-born, and promoted far beyond his station, Gaveston became Edward's closest companion and most visible symbol of royal favoritism. Titles, lands, influence, Edward handed them over with astonishing speed. To Edward, Gaveston was loyalty incarnate. To the English nobility, he was an insult wrapped in silk. The barons weren't upset merely because Gaveston existed. Medieval politics tolerated favorites. What it did not tolerate was exclusion. Gaveston mocked powerful lords, dominated access to the king, and became the gatekeeper of royal favor. Edward defended him obsessively, even when it cost him alliances. When the barons forced Gaveston into exile, Edward brought him back. When they exiled him again, Edward brought him back again. The message was clear. The king would choose his friends over his kingdom. This simmering political crisis collided with an external one, Scotland. By the time Edward II took the throne, Scotland was already in rebellion. Robert the Bruce had crowned himself king and was waging a relentless guerrilla campaign to secure independence. Edward I had nearly crushed Scottish resistance, but his death removed the pressure. Edward II inherited the war and promptly mismanaged it. In 1314, Edward marched north to relieve the siege of Stirling Castle. His army was massive, well-equipped, and confident. On paper, it should have overwhelmed the Scots. Instead, it marched straight into one of the most humiliating defeats in English military history, the Battle of Bannockburn. Edward's problems followed him onto the battlefield. He ignored experienced commanders. He failed to coordinate infantry and cavalry. He underestimated the terrain and overestimated sheer numbers. The English army advanced into narrow ground where Scottish forces, disciplined and prepared, neutralized English advantages. What followed was chaos, retreat, and collapse. Bannockburn wasn't just a loss, it was a revelation. The myth of English invincibility in Scotland shattered in a single afternoon. Edward fled the field. His army disintegrated. Robert the Bruce emerged not as a rebel king, but as a legitimate ruler with a battlefield victory that could not be ignored. The political consequences were immediate and brutal. Edward's authority evaporated. Nobles who already despised his favoritism now saw him as militarily incompetent. Gaveston, already executed by baronial rivals in 1312, had been replaced by new favorites, equally resented and equally divisive. The pattern repeated. The king defended his inner circle, alienated the political nation, and responded to criticism with stubbornness rather than reform. Rebellion followed. Parliament grew bolder. Royal power shrank. Eventually, Edward's own wife, Isabella of France, turned against him. Alongside her ally, Roger Mortimer, she invaded England in 1326 with shockingly little resistance. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate, and replaced by his teenage son, Edward III. What made Edward II's downfall so significant wasn't just the drama. It was the precedent. Kings were supposed to rule for life. Deposition was unthinkable. And yet, here it was. A crowned, anointed monarch removed not by foreign invasion, but by his own political class. England crossed a psychological line. If a king could be removed for incompetence, then kingship itself was conditional. Modern historians are often kinder to Edward II than his contemporaries. They point to structural problems, overmighty nobles, the financial strain of constant warfare, the lingering instability of Edward I's aggressive policies. All true. But sympathy only goes so far. Edward repeatedly chose personal loyalty over political survival. He mistook affection for authority. And when tested, by war, by crisis, by dissent, he failed to adapt. Bannockburn didn't just secure Scottish independence for a generation. It reshaped English politics. It emboldened Parliament. It weakened the aura of monarchy. And it taught the political elite that kings were not sacred forces of nature. They were managers. And bad managers could be replaced. Edward II's mistake was not loving the wrong people. It was believing that love could substitute for competence, consensus, and restraint. His reign became a warning whispered through the centuries, that favoritism corrodes legitimacy, and that military failure exposes everything else. And yet, England hadn't learned its lesson, because a few decades later, another king would decide that revenge was better than reconciliation, that authority meant punishment, and that ruling through fear would secure obedience. His name was Richard II, and he would discover that nobles remember grudges far longer than kings expect. 4. Richard II. Retaliation against the nobility and overreach in kingship, 1397 to 1399. There are kings who are broken by events, and then there are kings who break themselves trying to control them. Richard II, grandchild of Edward III and the first monarch in England's history to be deposed by his own cousin in a cold, calculated coup, didn't start as a tyrant. He started as a traumatized child king, crowned at 10, besieged by war, plague, and rebellion, and ended as a man who mistook symbolic power for political strength. Richard's reign was a long, slow build-up to collapse. But its most catastrophic phase came in the late 1390s, when he decided that his authority could only be preserved by purging anyone who had ever doubted him. Retaliation, not reconciliation, became his strategy. And it failed, not just morally, but spectacularly. Let's rewind. Richard ascended the throne in 1377, inheriting the crown from his grandfather Edward III after the premature death of his father, the Black Prince. England was still embroiled in the 100 Years' War with France and strained under the weight of high taxes and military setbacks. Within a few years, Richard had faced the Peasants' Revolt, an uprising so sudden and vast that it nearly toppled the entire feudal order. At age 14, he had met the rebels face to face and talked them down with poise that stunned observers. For a brief moment, it looked like England had found a precocious new leader. But appearances deceived. Richard's early reign was dominated by noble councils, especially the Lords Appellant, a group of powerful aristocrats who took it upon themselves to correct what they saw as the king's mismanagement and favoritism. In 1387, they staged what was essentially a coup in all but name, prosecuting and executing several of Richard's closest advisors during the merciless Parliament. For Richard, the memory of that humiliation never faded. It festered. Over the next decade, Richard plotted his revenge with the patience of a man playing a very long and very dangerous game. He bided his time, restored his authority gradually, and by 1397, 10 years after the Lord's appellant had shamed him, he struck back. But this wasn't just a political counteroffensive. It was personal. He began targeting the very nobles who had challenged his rule a decade earlier, charging them with treason, exiling them, imprisoning them, or worse. It wasn't just about removing threats. It was about sending a message. Among the victims were the Duke of Gloucester, Richard's own uncle, and the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, senior peers who had once controlled the kingdom in his name. Richard's actions were legally murky, morally dubious, and deeply polarizing. Trials were stage-managed, evidence was suspect, pardons were rescinded. And all the while Richard wrapped himself in the language of divine right, portraying himself as a semi-sacred monarch above earthly politics. To consolidate power, he surrounded himself with a small circle of loyalists, men who owed everything to his favor and nothing to the broader political community. It was governance by echo chamber. Parliament, meanwhile, was cowed into compliance. Richard began using new financial devices, including forced loans and clever taxes, to fund his increasingly lavish court and expanding household. England wasn't just being ruled, it was being watched. On the surface, Richard seemed triumphant. He traveled across the realm on elaborate royal tours, projecting wealth and confidence. He tightened control over the nobility. He even forced oaths of loyalty, an unusual and ominous step that signaled just how insecure the crown had become beneath its glittering surface. But underneath, everything was brittle. Richard's actions had alienated the very people a king most needed. The senior nobles who maintained the peace in the shires, raised troops in times of war, and sat in judgment when justice was dispensed. By targeting the old appellants, Richard didn't just settle old scores. He reignited old alliances. Then came the final mistake. In 1398, Richard exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of the powerful John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. When John of Gaunt died the following year, Richard seized the vast Lancastrian estates for the crown, breaking centuries of legal precedent and signaling to the entire nobility that property rights meant nothing when royal suspicion entered the picture. That was it. Richard had not only provoked a grievance, he had created a cause. In July 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned with a small force. What he found was not resistance, but support. Nobles who had once kept their distance now saw in Henry a chance to restore order, protect their holdings, and perhaps rewrite the rules of monarchy. Richard, caught off guard and politically isolated, returned too late. He was captured, imprisoned, and, in a moment that would send shockwaves through English history, forced to abdicate. Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, and Richard II became the first English monarch to be deposed in a formal, legalistic sense. No battlefield loss, no foreign invasion, just a slow-burning political implosion. The long-term consequences were seismic. The legitimacy of royal inheritance had been challenged. The divine right of kings now came with a footnote. Not if Parliament and the peerage say otherwise. Worse still, Henry IV's reign would face constant rebellion, as loyalists to Richard, or opportunists claiming his memory, rose up again and again. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses were sown in that single act of deposition. Today, historians debate Richard's psychology. Was he a visionary with a dangerous sense of grandeur? A traumatized boy king who never learned to trust? Or simply a man who believed that majesty was a substitute for management? Whatever the answer, the result was clear. Richard mistook symbolic power for actual authority. He believed that awe could replace trust, That ritual could overcome resentment, that wearing the crown made him unassailable. He was wrong. And yet, England wasn't finished with fragile kings who mistook silence for loyalty. A few decades later, a gentle, devout ruler named Henry VI would ascend the throne as a child. He would grow up into a man too kind for his own court, too indecisive for his own government, and he would preside over the collapse of royal authority altogether. 5. Henry VI. Failure to govern decisively. Amid faction and war. 1450s. If Richard II was a king who fell because he trusted the wrong people and ruled with theatrical vengeance, then Henry VI was a king who fell because he trusted everyone or no one, while ruling with none of the force or focus required of the job. His reign was not a sharp catastrophe, but a slow unraveling, a long, tragic exercise in the dangers of passivity at the top. He was the king who didn't lead, the monarch who watched, and the crowned figurehead at the center of one of the most chaotic and violent decades in English history, the 1450s, the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. By the time it ended, the realm had fractured into competing factions, the crown was no longer respected, and the idea of stable succession had become almost laughable. To understand how Henry VI ended up presiding over the implosion of Plantagenet England, you have to start with his origin story. He became king as an infant, just 9 months old, after his father Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422. And not just King of England. Through a contested inheritance and treaty, he was also proclaimed King of France. 2 crowns, no experience, no memory of a world before power. Raised by councils, governed by protectors, and shaped by court factions from birth, Henry VI grew up surrounded by ambition and manipulation, but lacked the personality or instincts to resist it. It wasn't just that he was uninterested in war or politics, he was unsuited to them. Devout, gentle, and bookish, Henry VI was more monk than monarch. In another life, he might have lived quietly among manuscripts and prayers. But on the throne, surrounded by sharks, that temperament became a liability, especially in a period where England needed a warrior king, or at least a king capable of making decisions. And decisions were everywhere. By the late 1440s and early 1450s, England was in crisis. The 100 Years' War had turned against them. French forces under Charles VII were clawing back territory. English possessions in Normandy, the backbone of English continental power for centuries, were crumbling. Yet Henry VI did not rally support, raise morale, or punish failure. He negotiated, dithered, delegated, and waited. And when things collapsed, he often pretended nothing had happened. The loss of Normandy in 1450 was a turning point. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a national humiliation. The English public and political class were outraged, and they demanded accountability. But Henry offered none. Instead, he relied on unpopular advisors, especially William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who was widely blamed for the disaster and soon murdered after being exiled. Public confidence in the monarchy was dissolving, and Henry VI did little to restore it. Worse still, the government was riddled with faction. Powerful nobles formed competing camps, each vying for influence over the indecisive king. Henry's inability to balance these factions, or to impose any sort of unity, meant the court became a battleground long before civil war officially broke out. Local feuds went unresolved. Lawlessness spread. The machinery of state was paralyzed by favoritism, personal grievance, and royal silence. Then, in 1453, everything fell apart. That summer, Henry VI suffered a complete mental and physical collapse. He became unresponsive, unable to speak, unable to recognize anyone, including his own newborn son. For over a year, England had a king who existed only in name. The government was forced to appoint Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm. This was not a neutral choice. York had a strong claim to the throne himself, and had long been sidelined by the Lancastrian court. When Henry recovered in late 1454, the damage was already done. Trust was broken. The Yorkists had gained ground. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, saw York as a threat to her son's inheritance. The political structure collapsed under the weight of suspicion and ambition. Civil war followed. The Wars of the Roses began in 1455 with the First Battle of St. Albans, a conflict between the supporters of the House of York and the loyalists of the Lancastrian king. It would rage off and on for over 30 years, reducing England's nobility through a series of bloody purges, shifting alliances, and royal overthrows. Henry's reign, which had begun with the hopeful image of a peaceful king bringing unity to two crowns, became a lesson in how the absence of firm leadership can be just as dangerous as tyranny. He was twice deposed, first in 1461, then briefly restored in 1470 before being removed again in 1471. Through it all, he seemed more like a prisoner of events than a shaper of them. And yet, it's important to note, Henry VI was not malevolent. He was not corrupt. His personal piety, his founding of educational institutions like Eton and King's College, and his genuine desire for peace show a man who wanted good, but was incapable of enforcing it. Governance is not about intentions. It is about capacity, and Henry VI had none. The long-term effects of his failure were enormous. The very idea of what it meant to be a king in England had to be recalibrated. Royal power could no longer rest on bloodline alone. It had to be demonstrated, defended, and, if necessary, taken. Henry VI's weakness institutionalized the idea that kings could be challenged if they failed to protect the kingdom. It also set off a chain reaction that would alter the English monarchy forever. But the crown would not remain a passive object of civil war for long. Because out of this chaos emerged a man who would seize it with determination, fear, and ruthless calculation. His name was Richard III, and his biggest mistake wasn't just taking the throne, it was forgetting to make anyone else believe he deserved it. 6. Richard III, failing to neutralize legitimacy. Doubts, 1483 to 1485. Richard III is one of history's most divisive kings, partly because of what he did, mostly because of how he did it, and entirely because of how it looked. In 1483, he became King of England. In 1485, he died on a battlefield with the crown ripped from his head. What happened in between wasn't just a royal mistake. It was a masterclass in how to inherit a kingdom and lose it before anyone fully believed it was yours. To understand Richard's mistake, you first have to understand the political landmine he stepped into. His brother, Edward IV, had restored the House of York to the throne after years of civil war, but his sudden death in April 1483 left the kingdom in a precarious position. Edward's heir, Edward V, was just 12 years old. In theory, Richard, named Lord Protector by his brother's will, was supposed to oversee a smooth regency until the boy came of age. A temporary arrangement, a caretaker role. Instead, within 3 months, Richard had declared Edward V illegitimate, locked him and his younger brother in the Tower of London, and taken the crown for himself. Even in the brutal context of 15th century power politics, this was a risky move. Richard justified his seizure of the throne with a legal claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a prior contract making all his children illegitimate. This rationale was accepted by a hastily summoned assembly, Titulus Regius, but to much of the country it looked like a royal coup. Here's where Richard's true mistake begins. Not necessarily in the act itself, but in the optics, the politics, and the aftermath. He did not adequately address the doubts his actions created. He took the throne in a fog of controversy and never cleared the air. His consolidation of power was swift but cold. He removed or neutralized those loyal to the previous king, alienating key Yorkist allies. He leaned on northern supporters who had little standing in the southern heartlands, where much of the traditional royalist base resided. And critically, the disappearance of the two princes, last seen in the tower, hung over him like a curse. He never convincingly explained their fate. Whether he ordered their deaths, allowed others to act, or was entirely innocent remains one of England's greatest historical mysteries. But perception in politics always trumps facts. In those perceptions, Richard lost the moral high ground and never got it back. Richard did make attempts to govern. He passed progressive laws, attempted to reform legal procedures, and even tried to cap legal fees. His court was relatively just, but none of that mattered. The legitimacy question haunted every decree, every pardon, every tax. He was ruling a kingdom that had not fully accepted him, and never would. His greatest threat came from a man with arguably weaker dynastic credentials, but far stronger political timing, Henry Tudor. A descendant of the Beaufort line through his mother and exiled in Brittany, Henry was little more than a nuisance at the beginning of Richard's reign. But with each passing month, as discontent simmered, Henry's cause gained traction. He cast himself as the unifier of the houses of Lancaster and York, promised marriage to Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth of York, and painted Richard as the tyrant usurper. The fatal confrontation came in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth. Richard had superior numbers. He had the terrain. He even had a reputation as a capable military commander, but he lacked something essential: trust. Key nobles, most notoriously the Stanleys, refused to commit until the battle's outcome was certain. When they finally acted, they acted against him. Richard fought bravely, even recklessly, but it was over. He died in combat, and Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield. The Tudor dynasty had begun. The Yorkist one had ended in a ditch. And yet Richard III's legacy didn't die with him. It metastasized. Tudor propagandists went to work immediately, turning Richard into a villain of Shakespearean proportions. Hunched, cold, Machiavellian, a murderer of children. Centuries later, historians began to question that image. Some even sought to rehabilitate Richard as a misunderstood reformer. But even the most sympathetic accounts struggled to defend the core problem. The way he took power undermined everything that followed. Had Richard called a great council before accepting the crown? Had he built a broad base of elite support or delayed his coronation until the legitimacy question was more convincingly settled? He might have bought himself time and trust. Instead, his rise felt like a power grab wrapped in legalese. His regime never escaped the shadow of its own origin story. Modern historians often describe Richard's reign as a tragic what if. What if the princes had been presented publicly, alive and well? What if Richard had ruled as protector, not king? What if he had prioritized unity over dominance? But history isn't built on what ifs. It's built on consequences. And the consequences of Richard III's decisions were enormous. A new dynasty, a rewritten national mythology, and a cautionary tale about how taking the crown is not the same as earning the right to wear it. But the Tudors, for all their stage-managed legitimacy, would soon face their own crisis of authority. One that began not with a battlefield coup, but with a wedding that couldn't happen, a pope who wouldn't bend, and a king who tore down centuries of religious tradition just to secure a male heir. The next royal mistake would not just shake England, it would split it in two. 7. Henry VIII, the break with Rome. Handled as a dynastic gamble, 1530s. Some royal mistakes are made in panic, others in arrogance. Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church was, fittingly, a bit of both. But mostly, it was about anxiety. Dynastic anxiety. The kind that festers in monarchs who know that their legitimacy, their legacy, and their very afterlife depend on producing one thing: a male heir. By the early 1530s, Henry had been king for over 2 decades. He had jousted, hunted, written theological treatises, and styled himself as a Renaissance monarch with divine favor and a killer wardrobe. But beneath the grandeur and the choral pageantry lay a central fear, that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to give him the son England required. He had one surviving child, Mary, and while a female heir was not unprecedented, it was politically risky in a kingdom where succession instability had meant war. So Henry decided to solve the problem himself, not with diplomacy, not with long-term succession reform, but by detonating England's spiritual order. His goal was deceptively simple: to annul his marriage and marry Anne Boleyn, whom he believed could give him a son. He framed his argument through Scripture, citing Leviticus to claim that marrying his brother's widow had been sinful and thus invalid in the eyes of God. But his actual motivation wasn't theological. It was dynastic. Catherine had failed to produce a male heir. Anne was young, fertile, and politically aligned with reformist factions. The obstacle? The Pope. Normally, an annulment was a manageable process for kings, but in this case it was complicated by politics. The Pope was effectively hostage to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who happened to be Catherine's nephew. Granting the annulment would mean humiliating the emperor's family and undermining papal authority. So the answer was no, again and again. Henry, never fond of being told no, decided the problem wasn't his request, it was the existence of anyone with the power to refuse it. Thus began a slow-motion constitutional crisis that would end with England severing itself from the Catholic Church and reinventing the monarchy's relationship to religion, law, and property. At first, Henry leaned into legal maneuvering. He sought support from English theologians, summoned Parliament, and pressured bishops. But when church resistance persisted, he escalated. In 1533, he secretly married Anne Boleyn. That same year, Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and his marriage to Anne valid. The king was now officially, if not canonically, divorced. Then came the nuclear option, the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Parliament, under Henry's pressure, declared the king the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The Pope was out. The monarch was now the spiritual authority. England had left the Catholic orbit, and not quietly. This was more than a break from Rome. It was a redefinition of sovereignty. Henry hadn't just restructured religion. He had embedded it into royal authority. Church property became state property. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands sold off to nobles and gentry, creating a new class of landowners invested in the regime. But not everyone celebrated. The break triggered rebellion, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a mass uprising in the north calling for the restoration of the monasteries and the old faith. Henry crushed it. Opposition from figures like Thomas More and John Fisher ended in high-profile executions. Loyalty was measured by oaths. The English Reformation, for all its theological implications, was born in bureaucracy, coercion, and surveillance. And it wasn't even finished. Anne Boleyn, who had promised so much, failed to produce a surviving son. She was executed in 1536. Henry would go on to marry 4 more times, still chasing a secure succession. Eventually he did get a son, Edward VI, but the religious chaos outlived him. England seesawed between Protestant and Catholic policies under his children, with consequences that would echo for generations. Modern historians still debate Henry's motives. Was the break with Rome a clever piece of state building disguised as personal crisis? Or was it a reckless gamble that sacrificed religious unity for short-term dynastic convenience? Perhaps both. What's clear is that the immediate need for a male heir justified a revolution in the king's mind, a revolution that remade the monarchy into something more absolute, more intrusive, and far more entangled with private belief. The long-term impact is staggering. The Church of England, with the monarch at its head, became a fixture of British life. Religious identity fractured. Persecution followed, both of Catholics and later of Protestants depending on the ruler. The break also shifted England's geopolitical stance, aligning it more with Protestant states and eventually pushing it into direct confrontation with Catholic powers like Spain. And all of it began with a marriage problem. Had Henry pursued a more diplomatic route, had he accepted a compromise from the Pope, or settled for a regency under a daughter, the rupture might have been delayed or avoided. But Henry's vision of kingship could not tolerate limitation. His personal crisis became a national transformation. He saw himself not just as God's servant, but as God's proxy. And with that conviction, he didn't just change England's throne, he rewired its soul. But the problem with radical change is that those who follow often lack the power or finesse to manage the world it creates. Henry's son, Edward VI, inherited not just a kingdom, but a theological minefield. And in the zeal to prove the Protestant order permanent, his advisors would make a classic mistake, going faster than society could follow. 8. Edward VI's regime. Overspeeding Protestant reforms, 1547 to 1553. By the time Edward VI ascended the throne in 1547, England had already endured 2 decades of religious upheaval, political bloodletting, and royal anxiety disguised as divine purpose. Edward was 9 years old, the long-prayed-for male heir of Henry VIII, and as such, the living justification for everything his father had broken to get him. The church had been torn from Rome. The monasteries lay in ruins. Martyrs and opportunists had already been made in equal measure. What England needed desperately was stability. What it got instead was a government in a hurry. Edward's reign wasn't really his, of course. He was a child, and the true power rested with his protectors. First his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Both men were ambitious, politically astute, and committed to Protestant reform. But their mistake wasn't simply that they pushed reform. It was that they pushed it too fast, too hard, and without a clear sense of how deeply the kingdom could actually absorb the changes. At the heart of the error was a misreading of England's religious temperament. Yes, Henry VIII had broken with Rome, and yes, Protestant ideas had taken root in pockets of society. But the majority of the population remained religiously conservative. They might have accepted a monarch as head of the church. They might have tolerated the disappearance of a few Latin phrases. But they were not, by and large, ready for wholesale transformation. That's exactly what they got. Under Somerset, the regime began dismantling the familiar rituals of traditional worship. Altars were replaced with communion tables. Images were stripped from churches. Chantries, endowments that funded prayers for the dead, were abolished. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, written in English, and imposed across the kingdom, replacing Latin services with something more doctrinally Protestant. To the reformers, this was necessary cleansing. To much of the population, it felt like an attack on everything sacred. The loss of ritual, language, and visual devotion, things people had grown up with, created disorientation and, in many regions, outrage. The result? Rebellion. In the summer of 1549, the country erupted in protest. The Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall was especially serious. An armed uprising triggered by local hostility to the new liturgy. The rebels demanded the restoration of the Old Mass, the Latin Rite, and traditional doctrine. They were crushed militarily, but the message was clear. Reform had outpaced consent. Somerset's political position weakened. Later that year, he was ousted by Northumberland, a more pragmatic operator but no less committed to Protestantism. Under his leadership, the reforms deepened. Church doctrine hardened along Calvinist lines. Clerical marriage was permitted. Vestments were simplified. Saints' days were abolished or ignored. A second, more explicitly Protestant version of the Book of Common Prayer was issued in 1552, removing any lingering ambiguity. Northumberland, more aware than Somerset of the political fragility of the regime, tried to tie the success of Protestantism to the survival of the Tudor dynasty. That meant preserving Edward's legacy at all costs, especially as the young king's health began to fail. In 1553, as it became clear that Edward would not live to adulthood, Northumberland orchestrated the most desperate maneuver of all, bypassing the legitimate succession in favor of Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant great-niece of Henry VIII. The goal was obvious: keep a Protestant on the throne and prevent Edward's Catholic half-sister Mary Tudor from reversing the reforms. But the scheme collapsed within days. Jane ruled for 9, barely, and Mary took the throne with widespread support, both for her royal legitimacy and her promise to restore the old religion. Edward VI's regime, for all its idealism and reformist zeal, left no lasting political structure to defend its achievements. The religious changes had been imposed, not negotiated. The government had governed with a tone of certainty that disguised a complete lack of cultural consensus. And when the moment of crisis came, there was no deep reservoir of public loyalty to draw upon. The people did not rise to defend Protestantism. They rose to defend order. Historians today are divided on how inevitable these reforms were. Some argue that England was on a Protestant trajectory regardless of who ruled. Others suggest that a slower, more cautious pace, combined with social relief policies to ease economic suffering, might have preserved both the faith and the peace. But what is clear is this: Edward VI's reign turned Protestantism from an elite project into a national mandate, enforced by law, but not rooted in popular belief. The machinery of state changed, religion, but not hearts. And when that machinery faltered, the old forms came rushing back. England would soon be plunged into a religious reversal, one marked not by speed, but by fire and fear. Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, would inherit the throne and attempt to undo everything her brother's regime had done. Her method? Restoration through persecution. And her mistake? Believing that fear could do what faith had failed to achieve. 9. Lady Jane Grey coup, forcing a disputed succession, 1553. If royal history had a hall of cautionary tales, Lady Jane Grey would be enshrined near the entrance, not for what she did, but for what was done around her. A young woman of remarkable intelligence, deep religious conviction, and absolutely no desire to be queen, Jane became the tragic centerpiece of one of the most audacious political miscalculations in Tudor England. Her reign lasted just 9 days, but the fallout from the attempt to place her on the throne would last much longer and reveal just how dangerous it is to try rewriting the rules of succession when the kingdom isn't in the mood for it. The scheme was born in fear, specifically the fear that the religious reforms of Edward VI's regime would be undone by his Catholic half-sister, Mary Tudor. Edward, still in his teens and suffering from a terminal illness, had been raised under the aggressive Protestant tutelage of Somerset and Northumberland. He believed in the Reformation. More importantly, so did the men around him, who had staked their power, wealth, and futures on the survival of Protestantism. With Edward's health in rapid decline by early 1553, panic began to set in. By law and custom, the line of succession was clear. Mary was next, followed by Elizabeth. Both daughters of Henry VIII, both legally restored to the succession under the Third Succession Act. But for the Protestant elite, Mary was a terrifying prospect. Not only was she a Catholic, but she had never disguised her intention to reverse the religious policies of her brother's reign. Her ascension could mean a return to papal authority, the dismantling of reforms, and, perhaps most worryingly for certain nobles, the restoration of confiscated church property. And so, a plan was devised. Edward, with strong encouragement from John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and Jane's father-in-law, drafted a document known as the Device for the Succession, bypassing both of his sisters and naming Lady Jane Grey, his cousin and a committed Protestant, as his heir. The legal mechanics of this maneuver were dubious at best. Parliament had not approved it, and the public had no reason to expect it. But the machinery was set in motion with remarkable speed. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died. 3 days later, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. But from the very start, the plan suffered from a fatal flaw. It had no widespread support. Jane herself, by most accounts, was reluctant. She was no power seeker. She accepted the crown under enormous pressure, likely believing that it was her duty to safeguard Protestantism. But the English people didn't see it that way. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and a true-born princess in the public mind, had a legitimacy that Jane could never match. And legitimacy in 16th century England was everything. Mary didn't hesitate. She raised her standard in East Anglia, gathered support from nobles and commoners alike, and marched toward London. The response was swift and decisive. Support for Jane collapsed almost immediately. The Privy Council, which had proclaimed Jane queen, defected en masse. Within 9 days, Jane was deposed. Mary entered London to cheering crowds. The coup was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Jane and her husband, Guilford Dudley, were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Initially, Mary showed remarkable restraint. She did not want to execute her young cousin. But after further rebellion, particularly Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, which aimed to prevent Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, pressure mounted. The very fact that Jane had once been queen, however briefly, made her a symbol, a potential figurehead for Protestant opposition. Reluctantly, Mary signed the death warrant. Jane's fate was sealed not by her own ambition, but by the ambitions of others. The mistake here wasn't just the attempt to alter the succession. It was the method, rushed, opaque, and lacking any social or political consensus. Northumberland assumed that if he moved fast enough, Parliament and the people would simply accept the new reality. He underestimated Mary's popularity, the strength of dynastic loyalty, and the importance of legal legitimacy. It was an elite power play that failed to account for the mood of the country, and paid the price for that misreading in blood. From a broader perspective, the coup reinforced a dangerous truth, that succession crises almost always destabilize more than they resolve. Even when they fail, they plant seeds of doubt about who truly holds power, and who gets to decide what counts as legal. Had Edward's advisors taken a different route, one of compromise or at least public persuasion, the transition might have been less catastrophic. But by trying to impose a queen without consensus, they provoked a backlash that not only restored Mary, but hardened her resolve, and Mary would not forget what had been attempted. Her reign began under threat, and she governed as if that threat never left. Her next move, one she believed was both divinely necessary and politically wise, would attempt to restore unity by force. But as she would soon learn, persecution doesn't heal division. It immortalizes it. 10. Mary I. Religious persecution as policy, 1553 to 1558. Mary I came to power on a wave of public support, a daughter reclaiming her rightful crown after an attempted usurpation. Her accession was greeted with cheers, bells, and banners. Even Protestants, nervous but respectful, acknowledged the legitimacy of her claim. She was Henry VIII's eldest child, a princess by birth and will, not by convenience or political decree. In her earliest months as queen, she was praised for her dignity, her resolve, and her forgiveness. And then she began to burn people. Not immediately. First came the policies, carefully worded and officially legal. Mary had spent years watching her mother, Catherine of Aragon, cast aside and humiliated. She had seen her faith pushed underground, her priests dismissed, her mass forbidden. For Mary, the Reformation wasn't just a political movement. It was a personal wound, a betrayal of her lineage, her church, and her God. So when she finally became queen, she didn't see herself as imposing change. She saw herself as restoring the natural order. That meant bringing England back to Rome. Her opening moves were cautious. She reintroduced the Latin Mass, removed married clergy, and welcomed Catholic bishops who had been exiled under Edward VI. She promised not to force conversions. At first, it looked like the Marian Restoration might follow the path of compromise and persuasion. But Mary wasn't interested in half measures. Her vision of monarchy was entwined with her vision of salvation. Her father had split from Rome for personal reasons. Her brother's regime had rushed Protestant reforms onto an unwilling nation. Mary believed she could repair it all, if not just through example, then through action. Firm, visible action. In 1554, the Heresy Acts were revived. This gave the state power to punish those who denied key Catholic doctrines, including the real presence in the Eucharist and the authority of the Pope. The Marian regime began arresting prominent Protestant figures, bishops, ministers, outspoken reformers, and subjecting them to public trials. Those who recanted were spared. Those who did not were condemned. From February 1555 to March 1558, nearly 300 people were executed for heresy. Many were burned at the stake, often in public squares, in the heart of communities that had once seen these same individuals as spiritual leaders or neighbors. Among the victims were well-known figures like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury and a key architect of Edwardian reform. The regime intended these executions as warnings, but they became something else entirely. Rather than quelling dissent, the burnings produced martyrs. Rather than reconciling the kingdom to Rome, they deepened resistance. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, published under Elizabeth I, immortalized the victims and cast Mary as a tyrant. Even moderate Catholics began to question the severity of her methods. The public, while not uniformly Protestant, grew uneasy with the image of queenship being linked to fire and punishment. Mary's mistake was not her faith. It was her assumption that force could manufacture belief, or at least silence doubt. Her campaign of persecution alienated the very subjects whose trust she had gained at the beginning of her reign. It turned religious tension into national trauma. The memory of the burnings would outlast her policies, outlast her reign, and shape how the English people thought about faith, authority, and monarchy for generations. The irony is sharp. Mary wanted unity. She got division. She wanted restoration. She got rejection. And while she imagined herself a savior of English souls, she became, through policy, not accident, the figurehead of a cautionary tale. In her final months, Mary was isolated, sick, and politically diminished. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, intended to anchor England to Catholic Europe, had failed to produce an heir. Her military ventures, particularly the loss of Calais in 1558, further damaged her reputation. But it was the burnings that defined her legacy. Today, historians sometimes push back on the image of Bloody Mary. They argue for context, that her actions weren't unusually harsh by the standards of the time, that other European monarchs did worse, that her motivations were consistent with religious norms of the day. All true, and yet beside the point, because Mary's rule wasn't judged only by contemporaries or scholars. It was judged by those who came after, by the people who saw smoke rise from market squares and wondered whether their queen saw them as souls or threats, by a Protestant regime that followed her and made political capital out of her moral decisions, and by a population that, while still deeply traditional, decided they no longer wanted the church to rule through fear. Mary's reign was short, but its lesson endured. Persecution might enforce compliance, but it never secures loyalty. It creates ghosts, and ghosts are harder to govern than dissenters. But Mary's legacy wasn't shaped by religion alone. In the middle of her reign, she made another decision that would haunt her. Marrying a man more powerful than herself, more foreign than familiar, and more politically toxic than any bishop. And in doing so, she found that a queen's heart might belong to her husband. But her kingdom answers to no one but itself. 11. Mary I. The Spanish Marriage Optics, 1554. If religious persecution stained Mary Y's reign in fire and legend, her marriage to Philip of Spain drenched it in suspicion and national paranoia. If the executions earned her the name Bloody Mary, the wedding invited whispers that she had become something else entirely. Mary the Pawn, Mary the foreign queen, Mary who had handed over England's independence for a husband who didn't even want to stay for dinner. The mistake wasn't just in who she married, it was how she framed it, how little she understood the anxieties of her people, and how badly the optics spiraled into political backlash. In 1554, when Mary announced her intent to marry Philip, son of Charles V and heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, it seemed, on paper, a powerful alliance. Mary was nearing 40, had no children, and was presiding over a kingdom that desperately needed dynastic stability. Philip came from one of the most powerful families in Europe. He was Catholic. He had imperial resources. He could help reinforce Mary's restoration of traditional faith and offer the possibility of a Catholic heir. But England wasn't interested in dynastic spreadsheets. It was worried about foreign control. The very idea of a queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, was still new. There were no precedents, no settled expectations. What happens when a queen marries? Does her husband automatically become king? Does England become subordinate to his decisions? Will he command armies? Will he take English wealth abroad? These weren't just theoretical questions. They were existential ones for a country still recovering from instability and deeply protective of its sovereignty. And then came the announcement. Philip of Spain. Philip wasn't just foreign, he was Spanish. In Tudor England, that meant more than a different accent. Spain represented empire, inquisition, and dominance. It was a deeply Catholic, deeply hierarchical power associated with heavy-handed rule. Worse, Philip was politically tied to the Habsburg dynasty, seen across Europe as the architects of absolutism. The English Parliament, the nobility, and even Mary's own council were rattled. Many feared England would become a satellite state of the Spanish Empire, drawn into its continental wars, its rivalries, and its economic needs. Mary tried to calm the storm. She signed a marriage treaty with strict limitations. Philip would hold the title of king, but he would have no sovereign authority in England. No foreigners would be given English offices. England would not fund Spanish wars. If Mary died without issue, Philip would have no claim to the throne. In theory, these safeguards protected English autonomy. In practice, they did little to ease public anxiety. The fact that such precautions were necessary only reinforced how serious the threat felt. The people didn't trust the words on the parchment. They trusted their instincts, and those instincts said danger. Then came the backlash. In early 1554, a rebellion broke out led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. Though small in scale, the uprising reflected how widespread the opposition to the Spanish marriage had become. It wasn't limited to radical Protestants or political outsiders. It cut across factions. Even some nobles who had supported Mary's accession now feared she was steering the country into a diplomatic trap. Mary's response was firm and unflinching. The rebellion was crushed. Wyatt was executed. Mary gave a powerful speech to Londoners, asserting her commitment to the realm and denying that she would ever betray it to foreign interests. Her defiance earned admiration, but not trust. In July 1554, the marriage took place. Philip arrived in England with all the subtlety of an occupying prince, accompanied by a Spanish entourage and a controlled presence. He was cold, formal, and visibly disinterested. The union was diplomatic, not romantic. He didn't speak English. He didn't stay long. He viewed the marriage as a transaction, an alliance for Habsburg interests. To the English public, it confirmed their fears. Mary was seen walking beside a man they didn't choose, bound in a partnership that felt more like vassalage than matrimony. The Queen's popularity, already shaken by religious policy, began to fray further. Her court was viewed as foreign-influenced. Her loyalty was questioned. Her reign became not just a matter of faith, but of allegiance. No heir emerged from the marriage. Mary suffered 2 false pregnancies, both of which raised hopes and then dissolved into national embarrassment. Philip returned to Spain, involved in imperial affairs and only nominally engaged in English politics. Mary, aging and increasingly isolated, was left to defend both a failing religious project and a political partnership that had never delivered its promise. Historians often debate whether the Spanish marriage made strategic sense. In some ways, it did. It placed England in alliance with a dominant European power and might have produced a Catholic heir. But its political cost was vast. It alienated Parliament. It damaged Mary's credibility. It painted her as a ruler whose heart overruled her head, and whose judgment ignored the emotional temperature of her people. The lesson is sharp. When monarchs marry, it's not just a private affair. It's national theater. And in that theater, perception can become destiny. Mary died in 1558, her dreams unfulfilled, her legacy scorched by both fire and foreignness. But the throne did not pass to Philip, nor to another Catholic. It passed to Elizabeth, the Protestant daughter of Anne Boleyn, Mary's half-sister and political opposite. And Elizabeth's first major challenge would be undoing the spiritual wreckage of her predecessors without igniting yet another war. A task made even harder by one chilling reminder. Across the Channel sat Philip of Spain, widowed, watching, and still very much interested in England. 12. Elizabeth I. Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, 1587. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth I avoided the one decision everyone expected her to make. She postponed, deflected, and danced around it with the kind of political acrobatics that became her signature. The question was simple. What should be done with Mary, Queen of Scots? The answer, when it finally came in 1587, was grim: execution. And though the axe fell on Mary, the fallout landed squarely on Elizabeth, and on England's political and moral legacy. Because in ordering the death of an anointed monarch, Elizabeth didn't just eliminate a rival. She crossed a line that monarchs rarely dared to acknowledge even existed. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots by birth and former Queen Consort of France, had been a political migraine from the start. Her claim to the English throne was, in the eyes of many Catholics, stronger than Elizabeth's. She was the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, and had never been declared illegitimate, unlike Elizabeth, whose birth was tainted by the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. To Protestant England, Elizabeth was rightful. To Catholic Europe, she was a usurper. Mary's early reign in Scotland had ended in scandal, rebellion, and forced abdication. In 1568, she fled across the border into England, expecting protection. What she received was 19 years of house arrest in a series of increasingly isolated and fortified estates. Elizabeth never quite knew what to do with her. Mary was more than a political liability. She was a symbol. To English Catholics, she represented restoration. To foreign powers like Spain and the papacy, she was a potential rallying point for intervention. To Elizabeth, she was a living contradiction. A cousin, a fellow queen, and a prisoner whose continued existence made every plot against the throne a little more credible. And there were plots. Dozens of them. Some real, some imagined, many exaggerated. From the Ridolfi plot to the Throckmorton plot, Mary's name surfaced again and again. But Elizabeth held back. She knew that killing Mary would set a dangerous precedent. Monarchs, after all, were supposed to be above politics, ordained by God and protected by the sanctity of their crowns. To execute one, even under the guise of justice, was to admit that a sovereign could be tried, judged, and eliminated like any common traitor. But in 1586, something changed. The Babington plot was discovered, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, coordinated with support from Catholic Europe. This time there was evidence, letters written in code, intercepted and decrypted by Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. The evidence pointed directly to Mary. She had approved the plan. She had agreed to it. This gave Elizabeth what she needed: legal grounds for action. Parliament and her advisors pressed for execution. The threat was too great, the risk of rebellion too high. Still, Elizabeth hesitated. She signed the death warrant, then claimed she never meant for it to be used. The council acted. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. The immediate reaction was divided. Protestants sighed in relief. Catholics recoiled in horror. Mary's composure on the scaffold turned her into a martyr. Her final words, her clothing, even her choice to wear red, the color of martyrdom, were seared into memory. Europe was outraged. Philip II of Spain, already antagonized by English support for Dutch rebels and privateers plundering Spanish ships, now had one more justification for war. The long-term consequences were profound. Mary's death removed the Catholic figurehead for rebellion, but it also gave England's enemies a moral rallying cry. Within a year, the Spanish Armada was launched. Elizabeth survived the crisis and emerged more powerful, but the decision to kill Mary never stopped haunting her. She reportedly blamed her ministers. She claimed she had been tricked. But history and conscience are rarely that flexible. Modern historians debate how much choice Elizabeth truly had. Some argue it was a calculated necessity, a security decision in a dangerous geopolitical moment. Others view it as a moral failure, a stain on a reign otherwise defined by caution and compromise. Either way, the decision redefined the limits of royal power. It proved that in Elizabeth's England, even queens could be expendable. And perhaps more tellingly, it reinforced the idea that religion and power were now inseparable in English politics. The Tudor state had not simply rejected Rome. It had constructed its own orthodoxy, in which political loyalty and religious identity were one and the same. Elizabeth's reign would continue for another 16 years, filled with triumph, propaganda, and the careful curation of a public image that still fascinates the world. But the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most unsettling choices of her rule. It solved one problem and created a dozen more. And as Elizabeth aged without naming a successor, the question of what came next grew darker by the day. Because in a country where queens could be tried and killed, and succession laws could bend for convenience, the next king would face a realm still simmering with religious tension, financial strain, and political mistrust. That king would be James I, Mary's own son. And he would discover that inheriting a throne came with debts that even royal blood couldn't erase. 13. James I, mishandling Parliament and finance, 1600s, 1620s. When James VI of Scotland crossed the border to become James I of England in 1603, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a nation trained to distrust its monarchs and a parliament growing increasingly confident in its own voice. For a king who prided himself on being a scholar of divine right, it was an uncomfortable arrangement. England wasn't Scotland. The crown wasn't absolute. And while James saw himself as a peacemaker king, bridging kingdoms and healing divisions, his policies, especially around finance and governance, only deepened the fractures he was supposed to mend. To be fair, James had his strengths. He was a learned man, unusually intellectual for a monarch. He believed in unity, preferred diplomacy over war, and helped end the long Anglo-Spanish conflict. But he also believed in royal prerogative, the idea that kings ruled by divine appointment and were answerable to no one but God. Unfortunately for him, England's political climate had moved on from that idea. Parliament, especially the House of Commons, had developed a taste for influence, and more dangerously, for accountability. The fault line in James's reign ran straight through finance. The crown was chronically underfunded. Centuries of war, court expenses, and inflation had drained the royal coffers. James inherited a system in which the monarch relied on Parliament to approve taxes, but he never mastered the art of negotiation. He demanded funds. Parliament demanded concessions. And when he didn't get his way, James turned to alternative sources of revenue, what contemporaries called impositions, benevolences, and monopolies. What Parliament called them was more to the point, shady. One of James's first major clashes with Parliament came over the issue of impositions, custom duties levied without parliamentary approval. In the case of Bates, 1606, the court sided with the king, ruling that he had the right to impose duties independently. But the political fallout was significant. Parliament viewed it as an erosion of their ancient rights. James viewed their resistance as insolence. The rift widened. He also made things worse by selling monopolies, exclusive rights to trade or manufacture specific goods, to courtiers and favorites. These patents were lucrative for the crown, but wildly unpopular with the public, who associated them with corruption and inflated prices. Parliament tried to block them. James responded with more crown-leaning appointments and more defensive rhetoric about his God-given role. The spiral continued. Even more damaging was James's inability to read the political room. He often gave lavish gifts to his favorites, most notoriously to George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, while complaining about Parliament's stinginess. To many, it looked like a king rewarding indulgence while scolding the nation for not footing the bill. All of this came to a head in the so-called Addled Parliament of 1614, so named because it produced no legislation, no taxes, and no progress. James dissolved it in frustration. Future sessions fared only marginally better. By the 1620s, mistrust had calcified into something more dangerous, a culture of confrontation. James's attempts to manage his son's marriage negotiations, including a disastrous attempt to arrange a match with a Spanish princess, further strained relations. Parliament suspected popish influence, financial mismanagement, and royal secrecy. James suspected Parliament of overreach. Modern historians sometimes cut James a little slack. The financial system he inherited was outdated. The political expectations he encountered were in flux. He did keep England out of major wars for most of his reign, and he helped lay foundations for a more united Britain. But even his defenders admit he was inconsistent, defensive, and politically tone-deaf when it mattered most. Had James forged a durable financial settlement with Parliament, a long-term agreement that traded steady taxation for political stability, he might have avoided the tensions that later exploded under his son, Charles I. Instead, he treated Parliament as an obstacle, not a partner. And so, when Charles inherited the throne in 1625, he also inherited the suspicion, the instability, and the deep well of resentment that his father had left behind. The next royal mistake would come not in the form of slow mismanagement, but in open defiance. A king who ruled without Parliament, taxed without consent, and believed that compromise was weakness. That king would learn too late that England had changed, and so had its appetite for absolute monarchy. 14. Charles I. Personal rule and fiscal workarounds, 1629 to 1640. If James III poked at Parliament's pride, his son Charles I shoved it down the stairs and locked the door behind him. Where James had grumbled and negotiated, often poorly, Charles simply walked away. In 1629, after a series of bruising sessions with an increasingly confrontational Parliament, he made a bold and historically catastrophic decision. He dissolved it indefinitely. For the next 11 years, Charles governed without it, raising money through dubious financial devices and enforcing religious conformity with a rigidity that made even his father's missteps look tame. This period became known, with no shortage of irony, as the personal rule. Royalists sometimes called it a time of stability. Everyone else called it a warning shot at constitutional government. At the heart of Charles's decision was a belief that kings should not be constrained. He believed in divine right not as a theory but as a mandate. Parliament, to him, was a tool, not a co-governor. When it refused to grant him the funds he wanted for his unpopular foreign wars, especially his disastrous support of Protestant causes in Europe, he treated their resistance as a rebellion in miniature. Dissolution became not a last resort, but a strategy. But a king still needs money, even in splendid isolation. Without parliamentary grants, Charles turned to fiscal creativity. He revived medieval taxes that hadn't been used in generations, most notoriously ship money. Traditionally levied in coastal areas during wartime to fund naval defense, Charles expanded it into a national tax and imposed it during peacetime. It was deeply unpopular. Resistance swelled. Legal challenges emerged, including the famous case of John Hampden in 1637, which, while technically unsuccessful, energized broader opposition to royal overreach. Charles also leaned on forced loans, fines for outdated laws, and the sale of monopolies. His court projected an image of order, but his revenue streams looked more like a patchwork of legal loopholes and coercion. The monarchy stayed solvent, barely, but at the cost of alienating almost every layer of society: landowners, merchants, lawyers, clergy, and commoners. Then came the religious reforms, or as many saw them, religious provocations. Charles's Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, introduced a high church Anglicanism that emphasized ceremony, hierarchy, and obedience. To English Puritans and reform-minded Protestants, this felt dangerously close to Catholicism. The king's insistence on uniformity, enforced through ecclesiastical courts, turned theological disagreements into political flashpoints. But the fatal error came when Charles tried to impose this religious model on Scotland. In 1637, he introduced a new prayer book, provoking riots in Edinburgh. The resistance quickly escalated into the bishops' wars, a costly, humiliating conflict that Charles could neither win nor afford. Out of options, he was forced to do what he had vowed never to do again: recall Parliament. In 1640, the short Parliament was summoned and dissolved within weeks. Later that year, Charles had no choice but to summon another. The long Parliament would become the venue for his unraveling. Its members were emboldened, angry, and more radical than before. They didn't just want influence. They wanted limits placed on the monarchy itself. Charles had miscalculated not just the politics of the day, but the direction of English governance. His personal rule, intended as a show of royal strength, had instead exposed how fragile absolute monarchy had become. By bypassing Parliament, he had taught it how dangerous kings could be. By enforcing religious uniformity, he had stirred resistance that crossed regional and class lines. By taxing without consent, he had turned constitutional grievances into a national movement. Historians often debate whether Charles was foolish or unlucky, perhaps both. But the deeper issue was his worldview. He could not fathom a political system where royal authority required negotiation. And when forced to choose between compromise and conflict, he chose conflict. Or rather, he chose policies that made conflict inevitable. The result would be civil war, the execution of a king, and the temporary abolition of monarchy itself. But before that final act, one more king would attempt to rule in a similarly uncompromising fashion. A man who, like Charles, mistook the symbols of power for its substance. His name was James II, and he would gamble everything on the belief that England would obey, even as it quietly prepared to replace him. 15. James II, alienating the political nation through religion and governance, 1685 to 1688. James II didn't set out to lose his throne. In fact, by most accounts, he began his reign with an advantage few monarchs enjoyed: a peaceful succession. After the tumultuous rule of his brother, Charles II, and decades of civil war and regicide still lingering in the nation's collective memory, many in England were ready for calm. James, they hoped, would deliver it. He was experienced. He was a former military commander. He understood the machinery of government. And most importantly, he inherited a monarchy that had been cautiously rebuilt after its complete collapse under his father. But James had one feature that no amount of diplomacy, seniority, or administrative competence could smooth over. He was openly, unapologetically Catholic. And in Protestant England, that mattered. From the very beginning of his reign in 1685, James's religion cast a long shadow. Though he promised to uphold the Church of England and maintain the existing order, few believed him. His earlier efforts to soften anti-Catholic laws, while still Duke of York, had already stoked suspicion. The Test Acts, which barred Catholics from holding public office, had forced his resignation from high-ranking military positions. And his secret marriage to the Catholic Mary of Modena had only added to fears of a Catholic dynasty waiting in the wings. Still, James came to power with considerable goodwill. The first parliament of his reign granted him generous subsidies. The political nation, the landowners, the gentry, the clergy, and the legal class gave him the benefit of the doubt. But instead of building on this foundation, James immediately began to test its limits. He filled important military and governmental posts with Catholics, not gradually, but conspicuously. He bypassed the Test Acts by using dispensations and royal prerogative to override the law. He purged Protestant officials and replaced judges who resisted his policies. He reissued the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, suspending penal laws against both Catholics and Protestant dissenters. The language was one of religious toleration. The effect, however, was unmistakable. The king was using tolerance to weaken the Church of England and assert royal supremacy over the law. Even many Protestant dissenters, who might have welcomed relief from persecution, grew wary. Toleration by royal fiat felt less like liberty and more like absolutism with a friendly mask. The fear wasn't just that James was favoring Catholics. It was that he was dismantling the constitutional balance between Parliament, law, and the crown to do it. Then came the real tipping point, the birth of a son in 1688. Until that moment, many had hoped the crisis would resolve itself. James was aging, and his Protestant daughter Mary, married to the Dutch Protestant Prince William of Orange, was the heir presumptive. The assumption was that England would suffer James's policies temporarily, then return to a Protestant monarchy. But with the birth of a Catholic male heir, that hope evaporated. A Catholic dynasty now seemed inevitable. The political nation panicked. In a remarkable display of coordination, a group of English nobles, both Whigs and Tories, secretly invited William of Orange to intervene. He landed with an army in November 1688. But what followed was not a war. It was a collapse. James's army and advisors defected. Even his own daughter Anne joined the opposition. Within weeks, James fled to France. Parliament declared that his flight constituted abdication. The Glorious Revolution, as it came to be known, was bloodless in England but seismic in impact. James had not been overthrown by mobs or war. He had been deserted by his own ruling class. His mistake wasn't just being Catholic. It was insisting that loyalty to him meant surrendering the very rights and structures that had slowly grown back since his father's execution. Historians have debated whether James had a long-term plan for absolute monarchy or whether he simply failed to read the room. Either way, the result was the same. His attempts to centralize power without broad consent triggered the exact outcome he feared, a revolution. And so, the crown passed not to his son, but to his daughter Mary and her husband William, not by inheritance, but by parliamentary invitation. The monarchy survived, but only by becoming something else entirely, constitutional, conditional, and permanently on probation. And while England's political elite had asserted themselves, the next crisis would come not from kings, but from the ministers and parties meant to manage succession, policy, and faction in the new order they had just helped create. 16. Queen Anne's ministers. Mismanaging the succession politics and party warfare, 1700s, 1714. When Queen Anne came to the throne in 1702, she inherited not just a kingdom, but a political culture teetering between evolution and collapse. The monarchy was now bound by Parliament. The divine right of kings had been exiled with James II. And yet, the crown still mattered, especially when it came to succession. Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, presided over a nation still haunted by fears of Catholic restoration and foreign entanglement. And in the final years of her reign, her ministers made a critical miscalculation. They allowed personal rivalry, partisan hostility, and short-term maneuvering to outpace the most important task of all, managing the future. The central problem was succession. Anne had no surviving children. 17 pregnancies had ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths. With no direct heir, the issue of who would rule after her loomed larger each year. The 1701 Act of Settlement had designated the Electress Sophia of Hanover, a Protestant granddaughter of James I, as the next in line. But she lived in Germany, spoke little English, and had never set foot in England. The choice was purely dynastic, not sentimental. It was a safeguard against a Catholic monarch, nothing more. Anne accepted the settlement grudgingly. She disliked the Hanoverians and resented the implication that Parliament, not Providence, would decide her successor. But she knew the alternative. Her half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Catholic son of James II, lurking in European exile and plotting restoration. That possibility was political poison. So the framework was there. The real question became, would it hold? Enter the political parties. The Whigs, champions of parliamentary supremacy and the Protestant succession, supported the Hanoverian line without hesitation. The Tories, more sympathetic to royal prerogative and skeptical of foreign influence, were divided. Some genuinely feared a return of civil conflict. Others quietly entertained the idea of a Stuart restoration, especially if it could be packaged as peaceful and moderate. Queen Anne's court became the battleground. Initially favoring moderate Tories, Anne shifted loyalties as factions rose and fell. Her reign saw a revolving door of ministers, alliances, and personal favorites. Chief among these was Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, Anne's closest confidant turned bitter rival. Their friendship soured into open hostility, with politics at the center of the fallout. As party warfare intensified, ministers became more interested in outmaneuvering each other than in managing national stability. The War of the Spanish Succession, which had consumed much of Anne's reign, became a political football. The Whigs wanted to continue it, securing Protestant power in Europe. The Tories wanted peace, fearing that prolonged conflict would destabilize the country and strengthen military commanders like the Duke of Marlborough. In 1710, a Tory landslide reshaped the government. Robert Harley and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, took over as chief architects of policy. They pursued peace abroad and party dominance at home, but they also danced dangerously close to the Jacobite cause. Bolingbroke, especially, played a double game, publicly backing the Protestant settlement while secretly communicating with exiled Stuarts. Meanwhile, the succession issue remained unresolved in practice. Anne refused to allow Hanoverian envoys into England. Communication with the presumptive heir, George of Hanover, Sophia having died shortly before Anne, was awkward at best, hostile at worst. No effort was made to build public support for him. No groundwork was laid for a smooth transition. Anne's health declined sharply in 1714. Her ministers, consumed by infighting, were unprepared. When she died that August, the political elite scrambled to implement the succession. The Whigs moved quickly. George was proclaimed king. Bolingbroke, sensing failure, fled to France and joined the exiled court of the Pretender, revealing just how close the Jacobite threat had come. The transition held, but barely. The mistake wasn't that Anne herself failed to name an heir. Legally, that had already been done. The mistake was that her ministers allowed party warfare and personal ambition to weaken the very system they were sworn to protect. They treated the succession as a chess piece, not the foundation of national continuity. And in doing so, they nearly delivered the crown back into the hands of the exiled Stuarts. The crown survived, again, but now under a foreign-speaking, foreign-born dynasty with a fragile grip on the political nation. The new king, George I, would discover just how skeptical England could be of outsiders, especially ones who arrived without charm, without consensus, and without understanding the precarious legacy they had just inherited. 17. George I and the early Hanoverians. Cultural distance and legitimacy problems. 1714 to 1720s. When George III stepped onto English soil in 1714, he arrived not with a hero's welcome, but with a mixture of anxiety, indifference, and thinly disguised disdain. He spoke little English. He brought a German court. He was unfamiliar with the customs, the factions, the feuds, and the theater of English kingship. He had not fought for the crown. He had inherited it by law, not affection. And in a country that had just narrowly avoided a Jacobite restoration, this unfamiliarity wasn't charming. It was dangerous. George's accession marked the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty, born out of the 1701 Act of Settlement, which prioritized Protestant succession over any lingering claims of the exiled Catholic Stuarts. On paper, this solved England's constitutional crisis. In practice, it handed the throne to a man many in Britain didn't know, didn't understand, and weren't entirely convinced should be king. From the beginning, George I's reign was marked by a glaring disconnect. He remained deeply tied to his German roots, more concerned with his electorate of Hanover than with his new kingdom. His inability, and apparent unwillingness, to learn English became symbolic of a broader cultural and political divide. Parliamentary leaders and common citizens alike struggled to view him as truly British. He traveled frequently back to Hanover, often for months at a time, reinforcing the sense that his interest in the English throne was more contractual than personal. This distance, both literal and symbolic, had political consequences. The early Hanoverian court was packed with German advisors and customs. British nobles were sidelined. Patronage flowed through unfamiliar channels. Even the king's food and rituals seemed foreign. These weren't just quirks. They were symbols of alien rule. And the Jacobites, supporters of the exiled Stuart line, exploited it. They didn't need to paint George as a tyrant. It was enough to portray him as a foreign accountant sitting on a borrowed throne. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 was the first real test. Supporters of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, son of James II, gathered in Scotland and northern England, hoping to rally support for a Stuart restoration. Though the rebellion was poorly organized and ultimately crushed, it exposed just how fragile the new regime really was. Entire regions of the kingdom hesitated to declare for the Hanoverian king, and many others watched and waited, unsure who would emerge on top. George I's reaction didn't help. Rather than building trust, he leaned harder into caution. He distrusted the Tories, many of whom had flirted with Jacobite sympathies during Queen Anne's final years. He leaned heavily on the Whigs, especially figures like Robert Walpole, ushering in an era of one-party dominance that would last for decades. While this stabilized governance in the short term, it created deep partisan resentment and further alienated conservative sections of the political elite. Perhaps the most consequential shift during George's reign wasn't in the monarchy's structure, but in its role. Because of his absence, language barrier, and disengagement, George became increasingly dependent on his ministers. Power flowed to the cabinet. Parliament grew more assertive. The concept of a prime minister, still unofficial, began to crystallize under Walpole, who effectively ran the government by managing the king's confidence and parliamentary support. The monarchy, once a source of active political direction, was becoming ceremonial in all but name. Some historians argue this was a natural evolution. Others see it as an unintended consequence of installing a monarch who could barely interact with his subjects. Either way, the early Hanoverians turned the English monarchy from a commanding presence into a distant symbol, one tolerated because it no longer interfered too much. And yet, even a reduced monarchy could cause trouble, because the court still mattered. Factions still formed. Patronage still flowed. And when George I was succeeded by his son George II, the political tensions between crown and court, ministers and monarch, only intensified. George II would inherit not just a throne, but a fragile balance of power, a deeply partisan political system, and a growing sense that the monarchy, if not careful, could become irrelevant, or worse, a pawn in the hands of its own advisors. The mistake waiting in the wings wasn't foreignness, but factionalism, and the court, left unmanaged, would soon turn into a chessboard of rivalries that no king could fully control. 18. George II's court politics, letting faction and patronage dominate governance. If George I ruled at a polite distance, George II ruled under a cloud of domestic confusion. He was more English than his father, more familiar with the language, more willing to play the public role expected of a monarch. But he was also deeply entangled in the one thing a constitutional king was supposed to avoid: court factionalism. His greatest political weakness wasn't tyranny or treason. It was letting the palace become a battlefield for competing egos, all while pretending that the real government didn't need his attention. George II reigned from 1727 to 1760, a period marked by a growing empire, rising global trade, and an increasingly complex domestic political structure. The monarchy, while no longer an engine of policy, still retained immense soft power through appointments, influence, and prestige. The crown didn't govern, but it decided who did. And that subtle power made the royal court a magnet for political manipulation. Rather than using his position to stabilize these dynamics, George II mostly let them fester. He saw politics as a mixture of personality clashes and private loyalties, a space to reward friends and freeze out rivals. And so, instead of a crown above faction, he presided over a royal household soaked in it. The most visible example of this was his long and complicated relationship with Sir Robert Walpole, effectively Britain's first prime minister. Walpole had risen to dominance under George I and continued to lead under George II, but only after an uneasy power struggle. The new king had preferred a different man, Spencer Compton, but Compton proved politically inept. Eventually, Walpole retained power, not because George II liked him, but because he was the only one who could manage Parliament, balance the budget, and keep the country out of trouble. George II's grudging acceptance of Walpole revealed a critical dynamic. The monarch was no longer in charge of policy, but of personnel. And how he exercised that influence, or refused to, shaped the tone of government. Rather than demanding unity or enforcing neutrality, George allowed court cliques to rise unchecked. He granted favors inconsistently, resented independent minds, and allowed his personal dislikes to bleed into ministerial decision-making. This contributed to a culture of corrosive patronage. Offices were distributed not for competence, but for loyalty. Political survival became a matter of favor, not performance. Corruption flourished in the shadows of royal indulgence. Members of Parliament began to see politics less as public service and more as competition for influence with those who had the king's ear. George II also maintained a famously tense relationship with his son Frederick, Prince of Wales. This wasn't just a dysfunctional family drama, it became a full-blown political liability. Frederick styled himself as a rival court, attracting opposition figures, disgruntled Whigs, and anyone out of favor with the king. The monarchy, which should have stood above party brawls, now had an internal split that mirrored the worst of Parliament's tribalism. Historians often argue that the period saw important constitutional developments. The cabinet became more coherent, the prime minister more central, and parliament more powerful. But behind that structure was a monarchy that had failed to lead where it still could have, by being a unifying presence. George II's refusal to rise above faction helped normalize a system where political cynicism, backroom deals, and public distrust became the price of doing business. And yet, the country survived. It prospered even. But the monarchy's role became smaller, its mystique dimmer. By the time George III took the throne, there were already whispers that the crown was little more than ceremony wrapped in tradition. George III, however, didn't see it that way. He wanted to restore royal influence, to rule as a moral, involved, and reforming king. But his reign would begin with a misjudgment far bigger than family feuds or favoritism. It would involve a war across the ocean, a group of colonies that refused to be taxed, and a revolution that began with a protest and ended with the loss of an empire. 19. George III. Escalating the American crisis, 1760s, 1770s. George III came to the throne in 1760 with ambition and moral purpose. Unlike his Hanoverian predecessors, he was born in Britain, spoke fluent English, and identified deeply with his country and his crown. He was determined to be a patriot king, restoring dignity and virtue to the monarchy, reclaiming influence lost to ministers and factions, and governing with clarity and restraint. His motto was Ich dien, I serve. But when service met strategy and principle collided with politics, he became something else entirely. A monarch presiding over the loss of Britain's American colonies, the greatest imperial blunder in the country's early modern history. The mistake wasn't that George III wanted order. It's that he tried to enforce it with the wrong tools, at the wrong time, against the wrong people, treating colonial subjects like wayward children and resistance like sedition, rather than negotiation. And in doing so, he helped turn what had been a manageable political dispute into a full-scale revolution. To understand the mistake, start with the context. By the 1760s, Britain had just emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that had given it control over Canada, Florida, and vast parts of India. But victory came at a cost: financial, political, and administrative. The national debt had doubled. The empire had expanded faster than its institutions could manage, and Parliament, eager to stabilize its finances, looked to the American colonies as a source of revenue. After all, hadn't Britain fought that war in part to defend those very colonies? The first major error was the Stamp Act of 1765, a direct tax on printed materials in the colonies. It was modest in economic terms, but explosive in political symbolism. The colonies had no representation in Parliament, and the principle of no taxation without representation quickly took hold. Protests erupted. Boycotts spread. Mobs formed. The act was repealed a year later, but the damage had been done. The imperial relationship was no longer built on shared loyalty. It was now filtered through mistrust. George III was not the architect of the policy, but he stood behind it. His mistake was less about initiating the crisis than about how he responded to it. He consistently backed hardline ministers and insisted on the authority of Parliament over the colonies, framing the issue not as a matter of mutual compromise, but of sovereignty. When a new round of taxes, the Townshend duties, provoked further outrage, George supported their partial repeal but maintained the tax on tea, just to assert that Britain could still tax if it wanted to. It was less policy than performance, and it backfired. By 1773, the situation had deteriorated. The Boston Tea Party was a direct act of defiance, colonists destroying royal property to protest taxation. George's response, via Parliament, was the coercive acts, or the intolerable acts, as the colonists named them, which closed Boston's port and revoked Massachusetts' charter. These weren't peacekeeping measures, they were punishment. And they did not isolate the rebels, they radicalized the colonies. At every turn, George III interpreted colonial resistance through a lens of rebellion and insubordination. He could not, or would not, distinguish between protest and treason. In 1775, as tensions reached their peak, he declared the colonies in a state of open rebellion. The following year, when the Declaration of Independence was issued, it named him directly, accusing him of tyranny, obstruction, and injustice. George III had become the face of imperial overreach, whether he intended it or not. Historians now debate how responsible the king truly was. Some argue that he followed ministerial advice, that parliament and bureaucracy shaped the empire's response more than the crown. Others point to his private correspondence, his consistent support for military escalation, and his refusal to entertain diplomatic alternatives as evidence that he played a decisive role. But either way, he symbolized the empire's intransigence, and the consequences were monumental. Britain lost its 13 colonies. The monarchy lost prestige. Parliament lost its grip on transatlantic authority. The revolution inspired global movements, shook the foundations of colonial rule, and marked the beginning of the end for the old imperial order. The monarchy survived, but its myth of unassailable wisdom did not. George III would later suffer from mental illness, becoming a tragic symbol in his own right. But the American crisis wasn't born of madness. It was born of miscalculation, of mistaking loyalty for obedience, and of failing to adapt to a changing world. And though the empire would rebuild elsewhere, the scars of that loss never fully faded, especially not for a future king raised in its shadow, one who would spend his youth as Prince Regent drowning in scandal, excess, and self-indulgence, redefining royal failure not through war or policy, but through public spectacle. 20. George IV as Prince, Regent, and King. Extravagant spending and reputational collapse. 1810s, 1820s. If George III's reign was defined by a war that redrew the world, his son George IV's was defined by a different kind of conflict, one fought in drawing rooms, newspapers, and back alleys, between monarchy and public opinion, image and reality, dignity and spectacle. As Prince Regent, 1811 to 1820, and then as King, 1820 to 1830, George IV managed to achieve something rare in the long history of royal misjudgment. He made monarchy look not just flawed or vulnerable, but ridiculous. It wasn't one decision that ruined George IV's reputation. It was 1,000 glittering choices made in the belief that if a king looked rich enough, dressed lavishly enough, and threw parties grand enough, the public might not notice the debt, the dysfunction, or the decay. Spoiler, they noticed. The story begins with a king in decline. By 1810, George III's mental and physical health had deteriorated beyond recovery. In 1811, Parliament passed the Regency Act, placing power in the hands of his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, already notorious for his debts, indulgences, and flamboyant lifestyle. As Prince Regent, George was expected to carry the burden of state with maturity and caution. He did not. Instead, he leaned into the role of spectacle. He became the face of Regency excess, a walking monument to gold trim, silk waistcoats, and unpaid bills. He commissioned grand buildings, threw opulent banquets, and surrounded himself with sycophants and dilettantes. The most enduring of these indulgences was the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a seaside pleasure palace styled like a Mughal fantasy, filled with dragons, chandeliers, and incongruous Chinese motifs. It cost a fortune. It served no political function. It was, in effect, a crown-shaped echo chamber. While Britain bled from the Napoleonic Wars and struggled under economic strain, George lived in a bubble of velvet and vapor. His personal debts soared into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, a staggering sum at the time, while Parliament reluctantly bailed him out again and again, fueling public resentment. Satirists had a field day. Caricaturists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank turned George into a visual punchline. Bloated, powdered, overdressed, and morally soft. But the most damaging episode came from his private life, particularly his disastrous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick. Forced into the union by political necessity in 1795, George despised his wife almost immediately. They separated within a year, and when he became king in 1820, he tried to have the marriage annulled. Caroline, defiant and popular among the working classes for precisely the reasons George hated her, returned to England to claim her title as queen consort. The result was a constitutional and public relations mess. George pushed for a bill in Parliament to strip her of her title and accuse her of adultery. The public, already hostile to his perceived moral hypocrisy, erupted. Crowds gathered outside Parliament. Pamphlets flew. The government dropped the bill to avoid further unrest. When Caroline tried to attend George's coronation in 1821, she was physically barred from Westminster Abbey. She died weeks later. George's popularity never recovered. Modern historians often describe George IV as a tragicomic figure, vain, insecure, and out of his depth. He was not unintelligent, but he lacked the discipline and seriousness that the crown required. His reliance on ceremony and self-image made him vulnerable to the very thing he craved, public attention. When it turned against him, he had no tools to reclaim authority or respect. And yet, his reign also marked a turning point. The excesses of George IV helped spark a slow shift in public expectations of monarchy. Respectability, not splendor, became the new currency. The idea that royalty should model restraint, charity, and moral rectitude emerged in direct contrast to George's lifestyle. It was, in many ways, a soft revolution, a recalibration of the monarchy's role in an age of newspapers, political reform, and expanding public consciousness. His successor, William IV, would rule with far less flair, but at a moment when monarchy's constitutional limits would be tested more directly than ever before. And in the next crisis, the crown wouldn't be mocked for indulgence. It would be feared for its interference in reform. A different mistake, but one born of the same lesson, that a monarch who misreads the mood of the people rarely controls the outcome. 21. William IV. Threatening constitutional balance during reform crises, 1830 to 1832. By the time William IV became king in 1830, the monarchy was no longer the political juggernaut it had once been. Parliament had taken center stage, ministers ran the machinery of state, and kings were expected to nod politely and sign on the dotted line. The job now was not to rule, but to reign, quietly. William, a bluff old naval officer with little political finesse but decent instincts, seemed like a good fit for the times, unobtrusive, earnest, and unlikely to start a war or scandal. But for all his good intentions, William nearly capsized the monarchy's fragile legitimacy by doing something the post-revolution monarchy was no longer allowed to do: interfere. The early 1830s were a moment of revolutionary energy across Europe. France had just undergone another regime change. Political unrest was brewing in the streets. In Britain, industrial cities were rising, but the system that governed them looked frozen in time. Parliamentary seats were still allocated based on medieval land ownership. Rotten boroughs with barely a dozen voters sent MPs to Westminster, while entire working-class cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no direct representation. Calls for reform had been growing louder for decades. Now, they were deafening. The Reform Bill of 1831 wasn't radical by modern standards. It aimed to redistribute seats, expand the electorate slightly, and clean up the most glaring inequities in representation. To the landed elite, however, it felt like a constitutional earthquake. Many Tories feared it would be the beginning of the end. First broader suffrage, then republicanism, then chaos. They dug in. The House of Commons passed the bill. The House of Lords crushed it. And that's when William IV made his entrance, not as a neutral referee, but as a player on the field. The reformist government, led by Whig Prime Minister Charles Grey, pushed the bill. The, again, Again it passed the Commons and failed in the Lords. Public anger surged. Riots erupted in Nottingham, Derby, and Bristol. Protesters burned effigies of anti-reform lords. The monarchy was caught in the middle, but William still had a powerful, if rarely used, constitutional tool: the ability to create new peers. The government asked the king to threaten to flood the House of Lords with reform-friendly nobles, tilting the vote. William hesitated. He didn't like the idea of manipulating the lords. It felt improper, almost aggressive. But he also didn't want a revolution. Eventually he agreed, reluctantly. The tactic worked. Enough lords switched sides to pass the bill in June 1832. The crisis ended, and the political system was rebalanced. But William, frustrated by the pressure placed on him, had come dangerously close to dismissing his government outright and provoking a constitutional showdown. The deeper problem was perception. The king was supposed to stand above politics. But William had wavered, at times seeming to side with the anti-reform camp, at others reluctantly backing the Whigs. He had flirted with direct intervention. For a few tense months, it looked like the monarch might actively block a reform supported by the public and the elected Commons. That possibility terrified people. What if the monarchy wasn't just a decorative relic, but a potential threat to parliamentary will? What if royal opinion could still derail democratic change? Though the Reform Act passed and Britain didn't fall into revolution, the lesson stuck. From that point forward, the monarch's political neutrality wasn't just a tradition, it became a binding expectation. The crown was to stay out of it. Full stop. William IV lived out the rest of his reign with less drama, dying in 1837 without a direct heir. His niece, the 18-year-old Victoria, would succeed him and preside over an empire whose contradictions were just beginning to show. But Victoria's first great political lesson would come almost immediately, and it would echo the missteps of her uncle. Never underestimate how fragile the crown's legitimacy becomes when it dips its fingers too far into the democratic waters. 22. Queen Victoria. The Bedchamber Crisis and Public Partisanship Optics. 1839. Queen Victoria was 18 years old when she inherited the throne in 1837, a teenager ascending to the apex of empire. The public adored her youth, her sincerity, her quiet sense of duty. She was the symbol of a modern monarchy, domestic, respectable, and above all politically neutral. Or so it seemed. Less than 2 years into her reign, Victoria made a mistake that nearly shattered that image and taught her, rather quickly, that even symbolic monarchs can still cause very real political explosions. It was called the Bedchamber Crisis, but the term makes it sound far more charming than it was. At its heart, this was a clash over constitutional roles and royal influence in a supposedly democratic age. The cause? Whether or not the Queen would agree to change her ladies-in-waiting when the government changed hands. To understand the storm, you have to know how the political winds were blowing. In 1839, Lord Melbourne, Victoria's trusted prime minister and political mentor, was head of the Whigs. The two had formed a close working relationship, some would say too close. He was a steady paternal figure, and she leaned heavily on him, both personally and politically. When his government lost a vote and he resigned, it left Victoria politically unanchored and emotionally unsettled. She had grown up in a bubble of court rituals and family politics. Melbourne had been her bridge to the machinery of governance. Now, she was being asked to hand that bridge over to someone she disliked and distrusted. Sir Robert Peel, the Conservative leader. Peel was no romantic figure. He was practical, reserved, and determined to strengthen conservative values without directly challenging the constitutional settlement. But he was also wary of being a puppet king's minister, and even warier of stepping into a palace where the royal household remained stacked with political opponents. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting, far from mere ceremonial figures, were seen as court insiders, confidants, and a potential line of political influence. Many were wives or daughters of prominent Whigs. Peel saw a problem. How could he govern with any authority if the Queen's closest companions were politically hostile to him? So he made a request, commonplace by the standards of the time. He asked that the Queen replace some of her Whig ladies with more neutral or conservative-friendly figures. Victoria refused, flatly. To her, the request wasn't political, it was personal. These women were her friends, her inner circle. She didn't want strangers in her home, whispering in her halls, watching her every move. But to Peel, her refusal was a warning sign. The young Queen might still see the crown as a political actor, and he wasn't willing to govern under those terms. He declined to form a government. Melbourne was recalled. The Whigs returned to power, wounded but intact. In the moment, the crisis passed, but its implications were enormous. Victoria's refusal to alter her household blurred the line between personal loyalty and political neutrality. The crown had been publicly seen taking sides, however unintentionally. Conservative papers railed against her. Questions arose. Could the monarchy be trusted to remain above party politics? Was this the beginning of a return to royal meddling? Lord Melbourne, to his credit, saw the damage and moved quickly to patch things over. He helped Victoria understand that her refusal had gone beyond etiquette. It had risked destabilizing the very system that protected her throne. She learned painfully and early that perception was power, and even symbolic decisions carried constitutional weight. Historians now view the bedchamber crisis as a pivotal learning moment. It marked the last time a monarch tried to resist a government change on personal grounds. From that point forward, royal households would shift with governments as a matter of routine. The incident helped solidify the principle of constitutional monarchy in practice, not just in theory. Victoria herself would grow into the role. Over time, she became a more measured, distant figure, still politically engaged in private, but careful never to publicly interfere again. Her personal transformation from headstrong girl queen to icon of stability was forged, in part, by this early blunder. But the monarchy had learned something else, too. Its power didn't only reside in speeches or appointments or crowns. It lived in the margins, in who got to whisper to the sovereign, who poured the tea, who stood closest during state functions. In a palace built on ceremony, even a bedchamber could become a battlefield. And just as Victoria began learning how not to be seen as political, she and Prince Albert would soon make another pivot, this time to the opposite extreme. They would attempt to remake the monarchy as a beacon of morality, seriousness, and national virtue. But as it turned out, moral perfection could be just as alienating as political favoritism, especially in an age of satire, social upheaval, and creeping republicanism. 23. Victoria and Albert. Moral monarchy. Rigidity. Underestimating public pluralism. 1840s, 1860s. For a nation built on paradoxes, industrial grandeur and urban poverty, imperial pride and democratic stirrings, the British monarchy in the mid-19th century attempted something audacious. Moral absolutism. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, fresh from weathering early political storms like the bedchamber crisis, launched into a new project, not to seize political power, but to redefine what royalty meant in an increasingly volatile modern world. Their answer? The moral monarchy. A crown polished with virtue. A palace transformed into a domestic sanctuary. A queen and consort who ruled not by decree, but by impeccable example. And it almost worked. Victoria and Albert genuinely believed that monarchy could be rescued from the scandals and excesses of previous generations by embracing domesticity, faith, seriousness, and responsibility. After decades of public suspicion, especially under George IV's lavish reign and William IV's near-constitutional collision, the couple repositioned the monarchy as the pinnacle of private virtue. Gone were the extravagant feasts, the morally dubious airs, the backroom political games. In their place, family portraits, temperance, Christmas trees, and a carefully curated image of duty. Albert, in particular, became the architect of this moral realignment. A German prince with a sharp intellect and reformist ideals, he saw the monarchy as a stabilizing force in a rapidly industrializing society. If Britain couldn't be ruled by kings, perhaps it could be gently guided by symbols. Calm, composed, exemplary symbols. The monarchy, in Albert's view, should embody the highest possible version of national values, giving ordinary people something to aspire to. Victoria agreed. They ruled through presence, through silence, through symbolism. And for many, especially the rising middle class, this approach had appeal. The monarchy stopped being the playground of aristocratic vices and became a model Victorian household, firm, principled, and self-controlled. But for all its high ideals, the moral monarchy had a flaw that couldn't be polished out. It underestimated the diversity and restlessness of the public it claimed to represent. The mid-19th century was an age of tumult. The press had exploded in circulation. Satirical magazines, political newspapers, and pamphlets reached every corner of Britain. London was becoming a metropolis of ideas, opinions, and contradictions. And not all of them bowed politely to the image of a prim, infallible crown. In fact, some openly mocked it. The monarchy's new image may have comforted the respectable classes, but it also created a wedge between the palace and the growing number of Britons who saw life not as a moral performance, but as a constant negotiation of struggle, satire, and survival. In a world of mill workers, Chartists, and political radicals, the Queen's court could feel alien, distant, overly austere, and fundamentally out of touch. And then there was Albert's problem. He was foreign. No amount of good intentions could erase the discomfort many in Britain felt about a German consort so deeply embedded in national life. Albert may have modernized the royal finances and supported industrial innovation, but he was also seen, especially by the press, as aloof, overly serious, and quietly authoritarian. His efforts to steer the monarchy into a new age of intellectual respectability often came across as cold paternalism. This wasn't helped by the couple's emphasis on controlling their public image. They were highly selective with appearances, avoided spontaneous interaction, and resisted anything that looked too performative or populist. Ironically, the very restraint that made them look virtuous also made them seem unreachable. Even the monarchy's increasing embrace of domestic imagery, think family portraits of children around the Christmas tree, paintings of Albert helping Victoria read dispatches, backfired in certain circles. To working-class families scraping by in crumbling tenements, the royal family's coziness felt like a fairy tale written by people who'd never touched the real world. There were moments when Republican sentiment flared. Radical newspapers published caricatures of Victoria and Albert as stiff, clueless relics. Demonstrations occasionally turned anti-monarchical, and although these threats never coalesced into serious movements, they chipped away at the illusion that moral perfection alone could preserve royal relevance. When Albert died in 1861, the monarchy entered a new phase of withdrawal. Victoria, devastated, retreated from public life. What had already been a carefully controlled image turned ghostly. The Queen became a shadow, admired from afar, but unseen. The moral monarchy, already rigid, now became spectral. Yet even in its errors, this era of monarchy laid down a new blueprint. The Victorian court had shown that power in the modern age didn't have to be loud or legislative. It could be symbolic, moral, even theatrical. But it had also learned, slowly and stubbornly, that symbols must evolve with the audience, or risk becoming relics. The next great royal mistake would be proof of that very point. Because as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the heir to the throne, Victoria's flamboyant, long-suffering son, would spend decades doing the exact opposite of everything his parents stood for. And in doing so, he would push the monarchy into its next era of danger, the age of scandal, spectacle, and public relations collapse. 24. Edward VII, as Prince of Wales, allowing reputation. Risks to shadow the institution, late 1800s. For nearly 6 decades, Edward VII was a king in waiting. Born in 1841 and crowned only in 1901, he spent most of his life not as monarch but as Prince of Wales, an unusually long prelude to a very short reign. And in that long waiting game, he made a very particular kind of royal mistake. He let the idea of monarchy be shaped not by policy or principle, but by personality, his own. Edward, known to family as Bertie, was raised under the iron halo of Victoria and Albert's moral monarchy. The crown, his parents insisted, was sacred. Duty was divine. Public behavior had to be above reproach. But if Victoria and Albert were the perfect parents for a monarchy in mourning, Bertie was the perfect problem child for a crown trying to modernize. And he did not go quietly. As a young man, Bertie rebelled not through speeches or ideology, but through behavior. He gambled. He entertained. He traveled across Europe cultivating aristocratic friendships and indulgent habits. His lifestyle was rich in silk shirts, racehorses, private clubs, late-night dinners, and a long, barely concealed list of romantic entanglements. Victorian society may have adored family values in print, but it obsessed over aristocratic scandal in practice, and Bertie fed both markets at once. He was, to put it simply, an attention magnet. And that was the problem. As Prince of Wales, Bertie held no official power, but he carried enormous symbolic weight. Every dinner he attended, every mistress he entertained, every extravagant waistcoat he wore sent a message. He was the face of the future, and increasingly, that face seemed out of step with the monarchy's carefully sculpted moral image. His parents were appalled. Albert, especially, saw Bertie's behavior as a betrayal of everything the royal household stood for. When a scandal broke in 1861 involving Bertie and an actress named Nellie Clifton, discovered at a military encampment no less, Albert confronted his son in person. Shortly after that meeting, Albert fell ill and died. Though it's unlikely the encounter caused his death, Queen Victoria certainly linked the two. She never quite forgave Bertie, and she never forgot. For decades afterward, Victoria sidelined her heir. She denied him serious political roles, kept him away from major state decisions, and treated his social life as a national embarrassment. In the public eye, she remained the embodiment of royal gravity, while Bertie was treated as ornamental at best and embarrassing at worst. Political cartoonists had a field day. He was Edward the Caresser, the Marlborough house set, the Playboy Prince. The man destined to wear the crown became a walking tabloid. But the deeper problem wasn't just the personal scandal, it was the institutional shadow. Every time Bertie appeared in headlines, the monarchy took a reputational hit. Victorian values, the monarchy's symbolic foundation, were supposed to stand for restraint, sacrifice, and seriousness. Bertie's lifestyle made a mockery of all three. He became a symbol of elite excess at a time when the press was becoming mass media, and the working classes were becoming politically conscious. The monarchy's very survival depended on staying above the political fray, and increasingly, above public mockery. And Bertie made that harder with every velvet-lined mistake. And yet, despite it all, he survived. More than that, when he finally became king in 1901, he surprised everyone. As Edward VII, he rebranded, not as a reformer or philosopher king, but as a modernizer of monarchy's public image. He streamlined royal protocol, made himself more accessible, traveled as a statesman, and even managed to ease diplomatic tensions in Europe. He presided over the Edwardian era, now remembered for elegance and optimism before the horrors of World War I. The public, curiously, warmed to him. After decades of scandal, his short reign helped repair some of the monarchy's lost credibility, but the damage had already been done in another, longer-lasting way. Bertie's decades of indulgence had taught the public, and the press, that royal behavior was fair game. The curtain had been pulled back. The mystique was thinner. If even the future king could be ridiculed in print, so could anyone. The monarchy's moral armor had been tested, and cracked. Future heirs would learn from this. They would live with the knowledge that private lives could become public crises overnight. Bertie may have salvaged his reputation in the end, but his long youth had reshaped the monarchy's relationship with the media and the people forever. In the age to come, royals could no longer afford to treat the public as an afterthought. They had to cultivate their image not just with privacy, but with proactive narrative control. Reputation, once a byproduct of duty, was now a full-time job. And for his son, George V, who would rule through war, revolution, and identity crises, Bertie's shadow was more than a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for how not to lose the monarchy entirely. But even he would misjudge one thing: just how deep anti-German sentiment ran when your last name was still Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. 25. George V. Underestimating how revolutionary the 1917 dynastic rebrand had to be. World War I. George V was not raised to be a king. He was the second son of Edward VII, a quiet naval officer more comfortable reading dispatches than commanding crowds. But after the death of his elder brother Albert Victor, George was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as heir to a throne still teetering between mystique and mockery. His father had ended his reign with surprising popularity, but the monarchy still carried the bruises of scandal and the fingerprints of decadence. By the time George took the crown in 1910, the world had changed dramatically, and then it changed again. The Great War shattered Europe's sense of order, buried millions in mud and barbed wire, and brought entire empires crashing down. Among the casualties, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns. Monarchies were dying in real time, and public faith in traditional authority was bleeding out in the trenches alongside the soldiers. George V knew this. He saw it happening. And yet, in the most crucial symbolic moment of his reign, he hesitated, just long enough to nearly lose control of the narrative. The problem wasn't new. It was his last name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. By birth, George V was a product of European dynastic intermarriage. His family tree was a spiderweb of German princes and British tradition. But to the public, especially after 1914, that Germanness became a liability. The war had turned Germany into the enemy, and anything associated with it into a potential scandal. Even Zeppelin bombings over London were blamed, in part, on the awkward reality that Britain's royal family bore the same name as its enemy. At first, the palace dismissed the optics. After all, George was British through and through, born and raised in England, steeped in naval tradition, and unwaveringly loyal. Why change the name for the sake of appearances? But war is all about appearances. And by 1917, as anti-German sentiment surged, public trust wavered. Satirical newspapers played up the contradiction. Crowds booed when the king appeared in public. Even minor court appointments with German-sounding names became lightning rods for outrage. George V was not a flamboyant ruler, nor a particularly imaginative one, but he was deeply attuned to mood, both domestic and imperial. He knew the monarchy could not survive without a sense of shared national identity. Eventually, he relented. On July 17, 1917, the royal family officially changed its name to the House of Windsor. It was a masterstroke of symbolic repositioning, short, punchy, unmistakably English. Windsor Castle, long a royal residence, now lent its name to a dynasty. It was the aristocratic version of changing the branding on a product to avoid consumer backlash. Suddenly, the royal family sounded like it had risen out of Saxon forests rather than German principalities. The public approved. The press celebrated. The crisis seemed, for the moment, averted. But the delay had revealed something uncomfortable. Even a loyal king could misjudge the speed at which legitimacy needed to be earned, not inherited. George had waited until the public's suspicion was dangerously close to tipping into rejection. The monarchy had not vanished, but it had lost another layer of its sacred armor. The lesson stuck. From then on, royal communication became a matter of strategy. The image of the crown was no longer passively respected. It had to be curated. George V, ever the pragmatist, leaned into it. He adopted a more visible public persona, appeared frequently in military uniform, and emphasized duty, family, and continuity. He reinvented monarchy not as divine rule, but as wartime solidarity. The monarch was now first servant of the nation, not its master. It worked, barely, but the damage of the delay never fully healed. The royal name change, while brilliant in hindsight, came dangerously late in the narrative. Had the war lasted longer, or had Britain suffered a revolutionary moment like Russia or Germany, the House of Windsor might have been a name remembered only in footnotes. George V's mistake wasn't malice or arrogance. It was hesitation. A failure to recognize that perception, in wartime, moves faster than facts. In waiting to adapt, he nearly let the monarchy be defined by its foreignness instead of its loyalty. The rebrand saved the family, but it came at a price. The monarchy would never again be insulated from political winds. Every generation afterward would inherit not just the crown, but the requirement to justify its existence, publicly, strategically, and often with theatrical precision. And as George V aged, he saw the writing on the wall. The old world was gone. The empire was stretching thin. His eldest son, Edward VIII, looked more interested in cocktails and chorus girls than constitutional stability. And in time, that son would go on to make one of the most destabilizing decisions in modern royal history, not by failing to rebrand, but by falling in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time under the harshest spotlight the monarchy had ever known. 26. Edward VIII, Abdication Crisis Mismanagement, 1936. There are royal mistakes, and then there are constitutional catastrophes. Edward VIII's abdication wasn't merely a personal crisis. It was a moment when the entire British monarchy stood teetering on the edge of irrelevance, scandal, and collapse. It was a crisis not because a king fell in love, but because he failed to understand the job he had inherited. A job less about personal fulfillment and more about impersonating a national ideal. Edward VIII didn't just resign a throne. He walked away from the entire mythos that kept that throne standing. When George V died in January 1936, Edward ascended the throne with immense popularity. He was modern, handsome, and fashionable. He had charm, charisma, and the casual confidence of someone who had never known a day of insecurity in his life. To many, especially abroad, he looked like the future. A man who could drag the dusty old institution into the 20th century with grace and glamour. But beneath the tailored suits and rakish grin, Edward harbored a fatal misunderstanding. He thought the crown was about personality, not role. About being admired, not being useful. He believed monarchy could be shaped around his own desires, and then was shocked to discover it couldn't. The scandal broke in slow motion. Edward had long been involved with Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who was married and then twice divorced. By the time he became king, she was at his side constantly. Their relationship wasn't exactly secret. Society insiders gossiped about it relentlessly, but the British press observed a self-imposed blackout, fearing official reprisal and public reaction. That silence shattered when Edward made it clear he intended to marry her. The problem wasn't just that Wallis was divorced. It was that Edward, as King of the United Kingdom and titular head of the Church of England, was proposing to marry someone whose prior marriages were still very much alive in the eyes of church law. For Edward, this seemed like a solvable problem. To the British government, it was a constitutional explosion waiting to happen. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin spelled it out clearly. Marrying Wallis would be incompatible with the king's role. The public might tolerate quiet affairs. They might even ignore discreet infidelities. But to openly defy religious tradition, constitutional expectations, and the social code of the monarchy's own making, that was a bridge too far. Edward refused to back down. He proposed alternatives. A morganatic marriage, where Wallis wouldn't become queen. A private union. A delay. But the deeper issue wasn't marriage logistics. It was trust. The government and palace officials no longer believed Edward understood or respected the constraints of constitutional monarchy. His insistence on prioritizing personal choice over institutional continuity raised alarms not just about this crisis but about future ones. What would he defy next? The press finally broke the story in December 1936. Public reaction was mixed. Some were sympathetic, others were outraged. Parliament was clear. There would be no support for a king who insisted on pursuing a relationship that endangered national unity and constitutional precedent. And so, on December 11, 1936, Edward VIII abdicated the throne. In a radio address heard across the world, he declared that he could not carry out his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. It was the most romantic justification for what was, effectively, a monumental dereliction of duty. The crown passed to his younger brother Albert, who reluctantly became George VI. Edward was created Duke of Windsor, exiled from the center of national life. He married Wallis in France, a quiet ceremony largely shunned by the royal family. The man who might have modernized the monarchy had instead nearly broken it. In the decades that followed, the abdication was reassessed countless times. Was it an act of love or ego, courage or cowardice? Was Edward a tragic romantic, or a man who wanted the perks of royalty without the burden of responsibility? Modern historians tend to agree on a few things. First, Edward had little interest in the day-to-day work of monarchy. He was disengaged, impatient, and dismissive of constitutional boundaries. Second, his obsession with Wallis was not just emotional, it was escapist. She represented a private life free from obligation. Finally, and perhaps most crucially, his failure was not in falling in love, but in mismanaging the crisis, politically, symbolically, and communicatively. Had Edward stepped back, consulted carefully, and shaped his personal desires around the constitutional framework, there might have been room for compromise. Instead, he treated the throne like a personal stage and was shocked when the curtain came down. The monarchy survived, but it had been wounded. The abdication showed just how fragile the institution really was. Not by revolution, not by war, but by romantic defiance. And for his successor, George VI, the challenge would be immediate and brutal: to rebuild the monarchy's moral authority while preparing for the most devastating war the world had ever seen. A man who never wanted to be king now had to prove the monarchy was still worth saving before the bombs started falling. 27. George VI's early reign. Underestimating the long shadow of abdication on morale. Late 1930s. When George VI became king in December 1936, he inherited a throne battered by scandal and confusion. The British monarchy, which prided itself on continuity and dignity, had just lost its most photogenic monarch in history, Edward VIII, because he refused to separate personal desire from constitutional responsibility. The abdication was not simply a moment of royal drama, it was an existential rupture that left behind a peculiar kind of wreckage, not physical, but emotional, not visible, but deeply felt. And at the center of the cleanup effort stood George VI, a man who never wanted the job, now tasked with restoring public trust while fighting his own sense of inadequacy. To the outside world, George seemed like the anti-Edward. Where his brother had been charismatic, George was reserved. Where Edward was dazzling, George was dutiful. He had no taste for fashion, speeches, or showmanship. He was a naval officer with a stammer and a preference for family life over ceremony. In short, he was the kind of monarch the crown had once dismissed as boring and now desperately needed. But behind the scenes, the palace underestimated just how deep the damage had gone. The abdication had destabilized more than just the royal succession. It had undermined confidence in the entire institution. For the first time in modern memory, the British people had watched a monarch walk away from the throne like it was a bad marriage. and the crown, once sacred, suddenly looked negotiable. Was it a job, a role, or just a costume? This was the fog that George VI entered, quiet, humble, and painfully aware that his reign was beginning in the shadow of failure. He didn't command loyalty by charisma. He couldn't lean on popularity, glamour, or narrative. What he needed was a clean reset of the monarchy's image. But the palace, still reeling, responded to the crisis not with bold engagement, but with caution. Serious caution. In the first year of George VI's reign, the public saw little of him. The new king followed tradition to the letter. There were no major speeches, no public charm offensives, no visible attempts to court the rapidly modernizing press. The idea, it seemed, was to restore stability through invisibility. Let the dust settle, avoid mistakes, project calm. It was a defensible strategy, but it was also a miscalculation. Because the abdication hadn't just shaken faith in the monarchy, it had awakened a new kind of scrutiny. The press was no longer satisfied with symbolic presence. The public, increasingly literate in politics and media savvy, wanted to feel emotionally connected to its sovereign. They wanted reassurance. Instead, they got protocol. Even inside the royal household, there was tension. George VI's wife, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, understood the need for warmth, for symbolic theater. She pushed for more family-friendly appearances, photographs, and public engagements. But the king's own anxiety and the advisors surrounding him leaned toward discretion. The result was a monarch at war with his own image, a man trying to be dignified in an age that demanded visibility. And then came the war drums. By 1938, it was clear that Europe was once again on the brink of collapse. Hitler had risen in Germany, rearming and expanding. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and Britain was deeply reluctant to return to the battlefield. But appeasement was failing, and the public mood was shifting. In this moment of national anxiety, the country needed a rallying point, a symbol of steadiness. And slowly, too slowly, George VI began to step into that role. The turning point was not a single event, but a gradual recalibration. The king began giving more public speeches, carefully scripted, heavily rehearsed, but increasingly confident. He visited factories, met with military officers, and, crucially, stayed in London during the Blitz, refusing to evacuate even when bombs fell near Buckingham Palace. His stammer, once mocked, became a symbol of perseverance. Each public word he managed to speak carried the weight of national endurance. Still, it's worth asking, what if the palace had acted faster? What if in the first year of George's reign the monarchy had launched a full-scale engagement campaign, acknowledging the abdication openly, reinforcing its moral relevance, and embracing modern media to tell its story? Could it have healed faster? Could it have avoided some of the skepticism that lingered into the early war years? Historians differ. Some argue that caution was necessary, that too much visibility might have triggered further backlash. Others see it as a missed opportunity, the moment when the monarchy could have redefined itself more boldly, not just as a fallback option after Edward, but as a new kind of leadership. In the end, George VI rose to the occasion. His wartime conduct earned him deep respect. He became a reluctant hero, and by the time of his death in 1952, he had restored much of the monarchy's dignity. But the early missteps, the hesitancy, the silence, the slow adaptation, showed just how fragile royal legitimacy had become. The crown no longer ruled by divine right or passive reverence. It had to perform, and perform well. And the next test would come quickly. Because as bombs fell over Britain and morale hung by a thread, even the royal family's most basic acts, where they lived, how they spoke, what they said, would be scrutinized as symbols of solidarity or separation. The next royal mistake wasn't in speech. It was in silence again. And it came as the war began to unravel the difference between shared hardship and carefully managed distance. 28. Royal family in 1939 to 1940. Early wartime messaging missteps, World War II. In the early hours of September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. It was not an unexpected declaration. Years of failed appeasement and mounting aggression had made it feel inevitable, but it was still a national trauma. The memory of the Great War loomed large in the minds of nearly every British household. Another war was not simply a foreign policy development, it was a collective psychic wound opening again. In that fragile moment, people didn't just look to politicians for clarity, they looked to the crown for emotional anchoring. What they got instead was a communications problem. The monarchy had spent the late 1930s cautiously rebuilding its image after the abdication crisis. George VI, unsure of himself and still finding his voice, both literally and figuratively, was beginning to grow into his role. But the early months of World War II revealed something the palace hadn't fully grasped. That in a total war, optics aren't just part of the strategy, they are the strategy. The public needed reassurance. They needed visible, emotional cues that their leaders were enduring what they were enduring. And the royal family, for all its efforts to appear dutiful, stumbled out of the gate. Take, for instance, the question of evacuation. As soon as war broke out, the government encouraged the evacuation of children from major cities. London, in particular, was expected to be a target of devastating air raids. Schools closed, families separated. Children were sent to the countryside with gas masks and name tags, sometimes without their parents. It was a policy born of logistical necessity, but it triggered deep psychological strain. And in the midst of that, the question arose, would the royal children, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, stay in London? At first the answer was unclear. Then, quietly, they were moved to Windsor Castle, not far from London, but far enough to be considered a precautionary retreat. To the palace, this likely felt like a balanced decision, avoid the full symbolism of evacuation, while still providing some security. But to many Britons enduring nightly bomb threats and rationing, the optics were off. The children weren't sleeping in cellars. They weren't separated from their parents. They weren't facing the kind of uncertainty most families were shouldering. It wasn't a scandal, but it was a missed moment. The royals seemed distant again, at the very time their symbolic value depended on closeness. The issue wasn't safety, it was visibility. At the war's outset, the monarchy's public engagement strategy was hesitant. George VI made formal speeches. His September 3rd address was widely praised. But appearances were sparse. The Queen, Elizabeth, was more instinctively comfortable with public interaction, yet even she was limited by protocol and caution in those early months. There were no surprise visits to bomb shelters, no impromptu tours of devastated neighborhoods, no early symbolic gestures to show that the crown would share the burden in full. Instead, the monarchy clung to traditional modes of communication, formal addresses, press-managed events, and carefully staged photos. The public wanted intimacy. They got distance. This hesitation extended into the way the monarchy responded to rumors. As the war intensified, so did gossip. Was the king planning to evacuate to Canada if Germany invaded? Would the royal family leave London if the Blitz began? What about the rumored bunkers under Windsor Castle? The lack of transparency created narrative vacuums, and in war, vacuums fill fast. To their credit, the monarchy did begin to course correct. By 1940, as the Blitz began and the bombs started falling, George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, more than once, they stayed. Elizabeth famously remarked, "I can now look the East End in the face," after the palace suffered damage. That line, simple and pointed, helped recast the monarchy's image as resilient and intertwined with the nation's suffering. But that moment of moral clarity came only after several months of uncertainty, and that delay mattered. because monarchy is theater, especially in wartime. It's not enough to survive. You must be seen surviving. The early missteps in 1939 to 40, however understandable, left a dent in the monarchy's narrative control. And while they recovered, it was a reminder of how quickly public sentiment can shift when symbolism doesn't keep pace with reality. The war years would eventually become a high point of royal popularity. George VI's quiet determination, Elizabeth's public empathy, and the image of young Princess Elizabeth joining the auxiliary territorial service all became part of the monarchy's redemption arc. But it started unevenly, with fumbled messaging and delayed empathy. Had the palace acted faster, embraced transparency, shared more vulnerability, stood closer to the line of fire, figuratively and literally, the monarchy might have solidified its emotional authority even earlier. Instead, it had to earn it gradually, one cautious public gesture at a time. And this pattern of reaction, waiting until pressure mounts before responding, would echo decades later. Because in a vastly different era, under a very different monarch, the royal family would again struggle with the power of perception. Not in wartime, but in tabloid time. And in that moment, it wouldn't be bombs that threatened their standing, but silence. A silence that would stretch across burned castles, broken marriages, and one of the most damaging decades in modern royal history. 29. Elizabeth II, Annus Horribilis. Era, slow adaptation to modern media, late 20th century. For most of her reign, Queen Elizabeth II appeared immune to scandal, beyond the reach of tabloid gravity, above the fray of fleeting cultural trends. She was monarchy's great constant, a living relic of wartime stoicism, draped in pastel, gloved in protocol, and buffered by a kind of timeless opacity. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the invisible scaffolding that had held that illusion together began to creak. The public mood was shifting. The press had mutated into something ravenous. The monarchy's traditional silence, once interpreted as dignity, started to read as distance. And then came 1992. The Queen called it her Annus Horribilis, her horrible year. But it was more than a rough patch. It was a full-blown communications failure, years in the making. And at the center of it all was a royal institution that had not yet realized it was no longer the author of its own story. To understand why the monarchy stumbled so badly in this era, you have to understand the world around it. Britain in the early 90s was a country reeling from economic downturns, political sleaze, and a mounting sense that old institutions were either corrupt, irrelevant, or both. The idea of inherited power, once romantic, now looked suspiciously like entitlement. And into that climate marched the Windsor family, wealthy, guarded, taxpayer-funded, and suddenly very, very visible. Because the media had changed. The deferential Fleet Street journalists of the mid-century had given way to tabloid empires that fed on scandal like carrion birds. Paparazzi culture was peaking. Leaks, wiretaps, and long-lens photography had turned royal privacy into a public sport. And the royals were deeply unprepared. They still treated the press as an external irritant, not as a shaping force in public perception. In 1992 alone, 3 of the Queen's 4 children separated from or divorced their spouses. Princess Anne finalized her divorce. Prince Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson after photos of her sunbathing topless with an American businessman appeared on front pages. But the crown jewel of dysfunction was the crumbling marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, an increasingly public poisonous unraveling that dominated headlines and shredded what remained of the monarchy's fairy tale mystique. Charles and Diana were no longer a couple. They were a civil war. Charles's camp leaked stories to paint Diana as unstable and manipulative. Diana's camp responded in kind, portraying Charles as cold, unfaithful, and unfit. The press, predictably, devoured both narratives and asked for seconds. Diana's famous BBC Panorama interview in 1995, "There were three of us in this marriage," would come later. But by 1992, the stage was set. The monarchy was no longer a family. It was a soap opera, and no one inside the palace seemed to know how to turn off the cameras. The Queen, ever a believer in silence and decorum, stayed mostly above the fray. But that, too, was a miscalculation. The public didn't want silence. They wanted reassurance, visibility, accountability. They wanted the monarchy to say something, anything, to show it understood the stakes. Instead, there was more misfortune. In November of 1992, Windsor Castle caught fire. It was a symbolically potent moment. The fortress that bore the family's name literally in flames. Over 100 rooms were damaged. Priceless art and archives were at risk. The image was too on the nose for satire. Britain's most famous royal residence, smoldering, as its family's reputation burned alongside it. And then came the truly avoidable part, the funding announcement. Initially, it was suggested that taxpayers would cover the restoration costs, an estimated $60 million. In a country where public services were being cut and economic anxiety was high, this went down like a lead balloon. Public outrage exploded. Why should citizens foot the bill for royal real estate while unemployment climbed and wages stagnated? The backlash forced a course correction. The Queen volunteered to pay income tax for the first time and personally contributed to the restoration costs. But the damage had already been done, not just to the castle, but to the monarchy's sense of timing, awareness, and self-regulation. It all culminated in the Queen's Annus Horribilis speech, delivered that same November. She acknowledged, in carefully chosen words, that 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. It was a moment of rare emotional candor. But it also underscored the problem. This came after months of chaos, not before. The monarchy had lost control of the narrative, and when it finally spoke, it sounded like a museum guide apologizing for the dust. Modern analysts often view the 1990s as the period when the royal family finally recognized it had to modernize, or fade. The Annus Horribilis was a breaking point, a wake-up call, and a harsh lesson in 24-hour perception management. The monarchy could no longer assume loyalty. It had to earn it. Not with ceremonies, but with transparency, accessibility, and a willingness to engage with a restless public. Of course, the worst was yet to come. The Diana tragedy would explode the monarchy's media strategy entirely, and the fallout would force reforms even deeper than anyone in 1992 anticipated. But Annus Horribilis wasn't just a prelude. It was the moment when the crown learned that invisibility had become its greatest liability. And this realization would slowly begin reshaping how the monarchy handled everything from finances to philanthropy to PR. Because if you're going to survive the 21st century as an unelected symbol of national unity, it's not enough to serve. You have to be seen serving, clearly, constantly, and in high definition. 30. Royal Household. Delayed modernization of soft power strategy, 20th to 21st centuries. For a long time, the British monarchy ran on what might best be described as inherited gravity. It simply existed, floating above the nation like a gilded satellite, held aloft by history, ritual, and the vague assumption that it served a purpose. But as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, that gravity weakened. The world sped up. Public trust became transactional. Institutions were no longer judged by their legacy, but by their value add. And somewhere in this acceleration, the royal household, the machinery behind the crown, found itself outpaced, outmessaged, and increasingly out of sync with the world it claimed to represent. This wasn't a failure of loyalty or tradition. It was a failure of adaptation. Specifically, a failure to recognize that in the age of mass media, soft power isn't ornamental, it's existential. and that the monarchy, which no longer governs, can only justify its place by being symbolically indispensable, which is a high bar, especially when you're still operating with the public relations instincts of a 1950s civil service department. To understand this misstep, we have to zoom out. By the end of the 1990s, the royal family had weathered an onslaught. The Annus Horribilis of 1992, the fire at Windsor Castle, a collapsing narrative of royal infallibility, and the death of Princess Diana in 1997, which triggered one of the sharpest drops in monarchical popularity in living memory. The crown had survived, but only just. In response, the institution began to modernize, slowly, cautiously, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind palace walls. There were new communication strategies, revamped charity structures, carefully planned media appearances. But this process, while necessary, was consistently reactive. It often felt like the monarchy was playing catch-up with a media ecosystem it didn't fully understand and with a public that no longer gave out reverence by default. Case in point, public funding. As scrutiny of government spending increased, so too did questions about the cost of the monarchy. What did Britain actually get in return for royal travel budgets, security details, and the maintenance of palaces? The answer should have been obvious: national unity, soft diplomacy, tourism, tradition. But the problem was, the palace didn't always articulate it clearly. For years, royal finances were presented in opaque, fragmented reports. The sovereign grant became a household term not because the public understood it, but because newspapers kept digging into it. The palace's initial response to such scrutiny was often defensive, sometimes outright dismissive. It treated public curiosity as intrusive rather than inevitable. The assumption seemed to be, if we ignore this long enough, it will pass. But it didn't. And so a narrative began to fester, one where the monarchy looked like a taxpayer-funded lifestyle brand rather than a national institution. It didn't help that public expectations were evolving. Modern soft power requires visibility, but not just in ceremonial form. People wanted to see their royals involved in meaningful, measurable causes. They wanted outreach that felt organic, not obligatory. They wanted the monarchy to prove consistently that it was adding value in a world overflowing with need. And here again, the institution lagged. The royals had long been patrons of charities, but the charitable model itself was changing. Old-school patronage, appearing at events, posing for photos, giving speeches, was no longer enough. Audiences wanted metrics, impact reports, hands-on involvement. The rise of celebrity activism, a la Bono, Angelina Jolie, Malala Yousafzai, raised the bar for what public figures were expected to deliver. Simply showing up was no longer a substitute for advocacy. Within the royal family, younger members began to intuit this shift. William and Harry, especially in the years before their fallout, spearheaded campaigns that were more emotionally vulnerable and mission-driven. Mental health, veteran support, anti-stigma work, these were not just ribbon-cutting exercises. They were cause-aligned efforts designed to connect emotionally with a modern audience. And they worked, for a time. But the institution around them, the royal household itself, struggled to match the tempo. Messaging remained cautious, formal, often overly sanitized. The palace rarely got ahead of stories. It responded to them. And in doing so, it ceded the narrative again and again, to tabloids, to Twitter, to a public no longer willing to wait for the official version. This wasn't just about bad optics. It was about missed opportunity. The monarchy still had enormous reservoirs of goodwill. But instead of investing that goodwill into proactive modernization, radical transparency in finances, meaningful devolution of ceremonial clutter, strategic digital engagement, it often defaulted to a preservationist mindset. Guard the brand, maintain the mystery, protect the crown, which is ironic, because the monarchy's greatest strength isn't its mystery, It's its ability to reinvent tradition while pretending nothing's changed. It's a performance, yes, but it only works if the audience keeps watching. And in a world flooded with noise, silence is no longer neutral. It's suspicious. To be fair, some reforms did come. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012 was a masterclass in national branding. The royal website improved. Social media accounts were launched. But the pace remained glacial. The household still operated like a Victorian bureaucracy trying to write press releases for a post-YouTube world. The result? Recurring legitimacy dips. Debates over monarchy versus republic that flare up every few years, not because of scandal necessarily, but because of silence. Because people can't tell what the crown is for anymore, beyond nostalgia and tourism. The real mistake, then, wasn't one single failure. It was institutional inertia. A reluctance to admit that soft power doesn't mean softness. It means strategic visibility, cultural relevance, and emotional resonance, none of which can be phoned in from a drawing room. And the consequences of that inertia are still playing out. Because in a world where every camera is a courtroom and every headline a potential referendum, even the oldest institution in Britain must now answer the simplest question: what have you done for us lately? And soon enough, that question would land squarely in the lap of the next monarch. A man long in waiting, forever in preparation, who would discover, to no one's surprise, that modern legitimacy doesn't come with a coronation. It comes with proof. 31. Charles versus execution. Decision by Parliament's radicals, underestimating the constitutional aftershocks. 1649. For most of England's long royal history, the idea of a monarch being tried and executed by his own people wasn't just unthinkable, it was heretical. Kings were supposed to be divinely appointed, wrapped in robes of sacred authority, immune to the laws they themselves oversaw. Even bad kings were usually just deposed, exiled, or politely shuffled off stage with a pension and a castle somewhere damp. But in 1649, Parliament didn't just break the rules. They burned the book. The execution of King Charles I was more than a dramatic political gesture. It was the moment Britain crossed a constitutional Rubicon, where the old logic of divine right collided with the new demands of accountability, and nobody quite knew what would happen next. Charles didn't get there by accident. He earned his place on the scaffold slowly, methodically, through years of misjudged policies, authoritarian missteps, and tone-deaf decisions that eroded every possible support base he might have relied on. His reign had been marked by religious inflexibility, aggressive tax schemes without Parliament's consent, and an almost supernatural ability to alienate allies. When civil war broke out in 1642, it wasn't just a rebellion. It was the unraveling of trust that had been stitched together over centuries. But if Charles was the architect of his own downfall, Parliament's radicals were the demolition crew who ensured the building was reduced to ash. By 1649, after years of brutal conflict, England was exhausted. The monarchy had been weakened, but not extinguished. Many still believed Charles could be part of a negotiated future, a symbolic figure with limited power. Even among his enemies, there was a sense that executing him would destabilize more than it would resolve. But the army, led by Oliver Cromwell and increasingly dominated by Puritan hardliners, had other ideas. They saw Charles not as a misguided king, but as a man of blood, who had betrayed the people by waging war against his own country. To them, justice meant accountability, and accountability meant trial, a public one. So Parliament created a High Court of Justice, essentially inventing a legal mechanism to put a king on trial for treason. The move was breathtaking in its audacity. Charles, unsurprisingly, refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. He argued, correctly by tradition, that no court could try a sovereign. But the trial proceeded anyway. It was a performance as much as a legal proceeding. The verdict was preordained. On January 30th, 1649, Charles III was executed in front of the banqueting house at Whitehall. He walked to the scaffold wearing 2 shirts, so he wouldn't shiver and appear afraid. His final words, cut off by the axe, were meant to affirm that he died the king's good servant but God's first. Or something like that. Eyewitness accounts differ. And just like that, the monarchy was dead. Or so it seemed. The immediate consequences were chaos wrapped in ideology. England became a republic, a commonwealth, governed first by Parliament and then by Cromwell as Lord Protector. But the vacuum left by the monarchy's sudden absence was not easily filled. The country lurched from experiment to experiment, purging royalists, suppressing dissent, and dealing with the awkward reality that executing a king didn't actually solve the problems of governance. If anything, it deepened them. Internationally, the regicide shocked Europe. Monarchs everywhere saw it as a dangerous precedent, a warning that even kings could be held accountable by their subjects. Domestically, it fractured opinion. Some hailed it as justice. Others saw it as sacrilege. Many simply didn't know what to believe anymore. The irony? Charles's death did not end monarchy. It revived it. By 1660, the monarchy was restored under his son, Charles II, with surprisingly broad support. Not because the institution had proven its superiority, but because the alternative, Puritan military rule, religious extremism, and legal uncertainty, had proved worse. So was the execution a mistake? From a tactical perspective, possibly not. It removed a stubborn and unyielding figure from power. But from a strategic standpoint, it shattered the myth that monarchy was untouchable, and in doing so, introduced a constitutional instability that would ripple for generations. Even after the monarchy was restored, it would never again enjoy the unquestioned authority it once had. The idea that kings could be challenged, tried, and even killed had entered the bloodstream of British politics. And that idea, once loose, never entirely goes away. In the centuries that followed, monarchs would be far more careful. Parliaments would be far more assertive. And the people, armed with the memory of one king's final walk, would never quite forget that the crown rests not only on tradition, but on consent. Still, not all royal miscalculations end in a scaffold. Some end in silence. Terrible, strategic silence. When the crown tries to suppress a symbol rather than outthink it. Like the next mistake, where Henry VIII decided that a man of conscience posed a bigger threat than all the rebellions in the realm. And in eliminating one problem, he created a martyr that would echo through history louder than any executioner's axe. 32. Henry VIII, executing Thomas More and alienating moderate opinion. 1535. If there's one thing Henry VIII was famous for, besides his 6 wives, his waistline, and his tendency to casually dissolve centuries of religious tradition, it was his obsession with loyalty. Not just political loyalty, but ideological loyalty, unquestioning, immaculate, ceremonial submission to the king's vision. The trouble with that, of course, is that people have consciences, and when your conscience and your crown collide, it rarely ends well. Just ask Sir Thomas More. More wasn't some radical firebrand or seditious enemy of the state. He was a scholar, a devout Catholic, a former Lord Chancellor, and a man whose intellect was matched only by his reputation for integrity. He wasn't trying to lead a rebellion. He wasn't plotting in cellars or smuggling manifestos. He was, in fact, silent, deliberately silent. And that silence, in the end, was what got him killed. By the early 1530s, Henry VIII was in the middle of his great rupture with Rome. Desperate for a male heir and unable to secure a papal annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry decided to go around the problem, and through it. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, effectively replacing the Pope in his own realm. It was a revolutionary act disguised as administrative reform. The crown, once sacred but spiritually subordinate, now claimed full spiritual authority, and Henry demanded that everyone else accept it, publicly. Enter Thomas More. More had served as Henry's Lord Chancellor, succeeding Cardinal Wolsey. He had been a loyal servant of the crown, respected across Europe for his legal mind and philosophical writings. But when the break with Rome came, he quietly resigned. No dramatic speeches, no protests, just retreat. For More, allegiance to the Pope wasn't a matter of policy. It was a matter of faith. But he also didn't want to incite conflict, so he stayed quiet, hoping silence might serve as a middle ground between obedience and conscience. But Henry wasn't interested in silence. He wanted affirmation. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, which required all subjects to swear an oath recognizing Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn and the legitimacy of their children. Implicit in the oath was acceptance of the king's supremacy over the church. More refused. Again, not with rebellion, not with speeches, just a refusal to speak the words. He didn't denounce the king, he didn't declare war. He simply said nothing. And in Henry's England, nothing could be treason. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for over a year. Pressure mounted. Friends and family pleaded with him to take the oath. Compromises were floated. Could he take the oath with qualifiers? Could he cross his fingers metaphorically? Could he survive without betraying his soul? More declined. Eventually, the government charged him with high treason and put him on trial. It was, like many Tudor trials, a foregone conclusion. In July 1535, he was executed, but his death did not disappear into the administrative machinery of state terror. It lingered. The problem with executing Thomas More wasn't just that it was morally questionable. It was strategically foolish. More wasn't a dangerous zealot. He was, in fact, the kind of moderate, respected figure whose support could have softened the blow of the Reformation. His refusal to endorse the king's supremacy didn't sway many people in his lifetime, but his death did. It became a rallying point, a warning sign, a symbol of what happens when conscience is treated as rebellion. In trying to eliminate a symbol of opposition, Henry accidentally created a martyr. And martyrdom is a tricky thing. It's louder than speeches, more enduring than policy. It travels through generations in whispers and stained glass windows, in books and sermons, long after political victories have faded into footnotes. The execution of More drove a wedge between the crown and the very moderates who might have supported reform under different terms. People who weren't sure about Rome, who were open to ecclesiastical change, but who now feared the king's demand for total ideological obedience. The message was clear. You didn't just have to obey, you had to believe, or at least pretend you did. It also sent ripples through Europe, where More was already respected as a humanist thinker. His death stained Henry's religious policy with the blood of philosophical intolerance, even as England marched toward its new Protestant identity. To this day, More remains a potent figure. He was canonized by the Catholic Church in 1935, declared a saint and a martyr. He's also been celebrated by secular thinkers as a symbol of principled resistance. His story has inspired plays, films, and endless scholarly debates, and all of it stems from a decision that, in the moment, seemed like just another act of royal enforcement. But here's the irony. Henry won the immediate battle. More was gone, the oath enforced, the supremacy affirmed. But he lost the longer war of perception. Because in a monarchy, especially one built on divine image and national symbolism, perception is power. And when you kill someone whose conscience speaks louder in death than your crown does in life, you've made a tactical error of royal proportions. Of course, Henry was no stranger to tactical errors. His reign was a symphony of bold strokes and brutal corrections. But the real lesson here? Sometimes silence is louder than protest. And kings, for all their might, should think twice before trying to extinguish a whisper. 33. James II. The 1688 misread. Thinking power could be centralized without consent. In the long tradition of royal miscalculations, James II's final act wasn't just a mistake. It was a misreading so spectacular, so utterly tone-deaf, that it managed to unite nearly every faction in England against him. And that's no easy feat. Tories and Whigs, bishops and dissenters, landed elites and urban merchants, all had their suspicions about each other, their grievances, their axes to grind. But James, with the political instincts of a lit torch in a gunpowder cellar, managed to light the fuse. Let's start with the fundamentals. James wasn't the first Stuart to believe in centralized monarchy. His father, Charles I, had already tried that, ended up with his head on a block for the effort. His brother, Charles II, restored the monarchy by understanding its new limitations. But James? James looked at the constitutional wreckage of the previous 50 years and thought, yes, more of that, please. The deeper issue wasn't that James II had ideas, it's that he had the wrong ideas at the wrong time, in the wrong country. A Catholic monarch ruling a decisively Protestant kingdom, he didn't just fail to appreciate the dangers of his position. He actively challenged them, thinking himself invincible behind the armor of divine right. In 1685, James ascended to the throne with some measure of goodwill. He was, after all, the legitimate heir. And many in the political nation, especially the Tory establishment, hoped he would rule with discretion. Maybe even follow his brother's model. Live and let live. Don't rock the boat. Don't provoke the Church of England. Instead, James went full absolutist. Within months, he was appointing Catholics to high office, overriding legal statutes, and trying to suspend laws at will using the so-called dispensing power. He established a standing army, led in part by Catholic officers, and garrisoned it within striking distance of London. Always a good way to remind Parliament who's boss, and an even better way to spook every landowner in the realm. And let's talk about religion, because for James, politics and religion were inseparable. He didn't just want tolerance for Catholics. He wanted equality and, ideally, a return to Catholic prominence. He issued the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, suspending penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike. It sounded progressive, even modern, but it bypassed Parliament and came with a strong whiff of royal fiat. Worse, many suspected it was a Trojan horse, the opening act of a plan to re-Catholicize England by stealth. When 7 Anglican bishops refused to read the declaration from their pulpits, James had them arrested and put on trial for seditious libel. They were acquitted, and public celebration exploded across the country. The message was clear. James wasn't just unpopular, he was dangerous, but the final nail didn't come from policy. It came from biology. For years, the political elite had quietly tolerated James's antics in the hope that they were temporary. His Protestant daughter Mary was next in line to the throne, and she was married to the solidly Protestant William of Orange. Let the old king fumble along, they figured. Then June 1688 happened. James had a son. Suddenly, the future looked Catholic, dynastic, and permanent. That's when the invitation to William was sent, one of the more polite euphemisms in English history. A group of leading nobles invited William of Orange to come rescue the kingdom, which he did, landing in England in November 1688, with an army and a PR campaign declaring he came in defense of the Protestant religion and English liberties. James's support evaporated almost instantly. His army defected. His daughter Anne joined the opposition. Even his closest advisors jumped ship. Realizing the tide had not just turned but drowned him, James fled to France, dropping the royal seal into the Thames as he went. A king outwitted by reality, undone not by assassination or battle, but by a cascade of quiet, elite consensus. Parliament didn't call it a revolution at first. They called it a vacancy. The throne was empty, they said, not because they deposed James, but because he abdicated by running away. It was constitutional theater, designed to preserve the idea that law and legitimacy were still intact. But behind the curtain, something had fundamentally changed. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 established once and for all that English monarchy was conditional, not absolute. Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, but with strings attached, a Declaration of Rights, later codified in the Bill of Rights 1689, which laid out limits on royal authority, guaranteed certain civil liberties, and confirmed that no king or queen could govern without Parliament's consent. James II, in thinking he could centralize power without political buy-in, ended up triggering the very opposite. His misread of the constitutional temperature didn't just cost him his throne, it reset the monarchy forever. Today, James is often remembered as a tragic figure, more stubborn than sinister, more inflexible than tyrannical. But in politics, tragedy and disaster often share a border, and James crossed it gleefully. Because in the end, he believed that authority could be imposed from the top down, when in fact, England's constitutional game had already shifted sideways, toward Parliament, toward public consent, and toward a monarchy that would henceforth reign but not rule. The lesson wasn't lost on future monarchs. But some lessons, apparently, needed repeating. Because generations later, another monarch, or rather, a future one, would make a similarly risky bet. That prestige could survive personal scandal, and that image didn't need modern strategy to remain sacred. But in a world of old cameras, tabloids, and televised confessions, the stakes would be very different, and the cost, once again, would be royal.